At first light, the Sahara looks almost motionless. The dunes hold their long shadows. Gravel plains stretch toward horizons that seem empty enough to erase scale itself. Wind lifts pale dust from the surface and carries it across land where rain may not fall for years. Yet beneath that silence lies a different geography, one written not in living water, but in buried channels, drowned sediments, fossil shorelines, and the outlines of lakes that no longer exist. The desert has not merely covered an older landscape. In many places, it has preserved one. From the ground, the clues can be difficult to see. A dry valley may look like nothing more than a shallow depression between ridges. A line of darker sediment may seem accidental. A broad basin may resemble any other hollow in the sand. But from above, the pattern changes. Radar images pierce through loose surface deposits and reveal branching networks shaped like the veins of a leaf. Ancient channels converge, widen, divide, and bend toward basins that once held water. Some run for hundreds of kilometers. Others vanish beneath dunes or end at shorelines now stranded far from any modern lake. What appears today as one of the driest regions on Earth carries the unmistakable architecture of rivers. One of the most striking examples lies in Western Sahara, where researchers identified the remains of a vast river system often associated with the name Tamanrasset. It once gathered water from highlands deep in the continent and carried it westward toward the Atlantic. The river is gone from the surface, but its route survives in buried valleys and in sediments deposited offshore. Grains washed from the interior settled on the ocean floor, forming a record of times when water crossed territory now dominated by rock, salt, and sand. The evidence suggests that this was not a minor seasonal stream. During humid phases, it may have been one of the largest river systems in Africa. That discovery changes the scale of the mystery. It is one thing to imagine scattered pools appearing after unusual rain. It is another to picture an organized drainage system carrying water across the desert, linking mountains to floodplains and floodplains to the sea. Rivers require more than a single storm. They require repeated runoff, connected catchments, and landscapes wet enough for water to travel instead of disappearing immediately into sand or heat. Their existence means that the Sahara once worked as a different kind of world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the story hidden here is not about a desert briefly interrupted by rain. It is about a continent-scale transformation whose traces still shape how scientists understand climate, migration, and the human past. The vanished rivers are only part of the evidence. Across the Sahara and Sahel, old shorelines curve around basins now occupied by dust. Some stand many meters above present water levels. Others surround places where no lake remains at all. Along these ancient margins are layers of shells, fish bones, microscopic algae, and mineral deposits that formed in water. In certain mountain craters, sediments record lakes deep enough to sustain long-lived aquatic ecosystems. Farther south, the enormous basin of Lake Chad preserves the memory of a far larger body of water, often called Mega Chad, whose shores once extended across an area vastly greater than the modern lake. To stand on one of those old shorelines today would be disorienting. The land may appear flat and lifeless, but the curve beneath one's feet once marked the meeting point between water and land. Waves moved across it. Reeds may have grown nearby. Fish lived where dust now gathers. Animals came to drink. Human groups camped near the edge, leaving behind tools, hearths, pottery, and images carved or painted on stone. The shoreline is not simply a geological feature, it is the border of a lost inhabited world. The Sahara's buried hydrology also appears in fossil springs. In parts of Sudan and the eastern Sahel, old spring deposits show that groundwater once reached the surface in places that later became severely dry. These springs could persist when surrounding conditions were difficult, creating local refuges before the full humid phase developed. This matters for the long transition from the cold, arid world near the end of the Ice Age. Around 20,000 BCE, the Sahara was not yet the green landscape often imagined in popular reconstructions. It was generally colder, drier, and in many regions more hostile than today, with active dunes and limited water. Yet pockets of moisture, mountain catchments, and groundwater-fed springs may have remained, offering narrow corridors of life in an otherwise severe environment. The transformation did not arrive everywhere at once. That point is essential. Green Sahara is a useful phrase, but it can create the false image of a single uniform grassland stretching from the Atlantic to the Nile. The evidence instead points to a mosaic. Some regions held open savanna, others supported shrubland, seasonal wetlands, or wooded valleys. Lakes expanded and contracted at different times. Mountain zones captured more rainfall than low basins. Certain interior areas remained comparatively dry, even while nearby regions became far wetter. What survives in the record suggests a landscape constantly shifting at its edges. This unevenness is one reason the old rivers matter so much. They connected places that would otherwise have remained isolated. A wet mountain range could feed a distant basin. Seasonal rainfall could become a channel, then a floodplain, then a chain of lakes. Water moved across ecological boundaries, carrying sediment, plants, fish, and opportunities for animals and people. A river was not only a line on the landscape, it was a moving corridor through a continent undergoing change. Some of these corridors are now invisible except to instruments. Satellite radar can detect buried channels because compacted river sediments respond differently from loose sand. Marine cores can identify pulses of material carried out from the continent. Fossil pollen reveals which plants grew nearby. Diatoms, tiny algae with durable silica shells, record whether a lake was deep, shallow, fresh, or increasingly saline. Oxygen isotopes preserve changes in evaporation and rainfall. Each clue is incomplete by itself, but together they form a geography that the modern eye cannot see. There is still uncertainty. Scholars continue to debate the exact timing, size, and duration of some river systems, and no single map can capture every century of change. A channel may have flowed strongly during one humid pulse, weakened during another, and vanished before water returned elsewhere. The Sahara has shifted between wetter and drier states many times over hundreds of thousands of years. The green phase most closely associated with early Holocene human life was only the latest major expression of a much older rhythm. Even so, the conclusion is difficult to escape. The desert remembers water. It remembers in the shape of valleys buried under dunes, in lake beds coated with salt, in shells lying far from any shore, and in sediments carried to an ocean by rivers no living person has seen. The modern Sahara is not a permanent face of the land. It is one moment in a longer cycle. And once that idea settles in, the silence of the desert begins to feel different. The emptiness is no longer empty. Beneath the sand lies a landscape waiting to be reconstructed, rivers crossing open country, lakes filling ancient basins, springs rising from stone, and distant highlands feeding waters that travelled toward vanished shores. The question is no longer whether the Sahara changed. The question is, what force could alter such an immense region so completely, turning channels into dunes and then, for a time, bringing them back to life? The force capable of remaking the Sahara begins far beyond Africa, in the slow geometry of Earth's movement through space. The planet does not circle the Sun in a perfectly fixed pattern. Its orbit changes shape over long periods. Its axis tilts slightly more or less, and it wobbles like a slowly turning top. These motions unfold too gradually to notice within a human lifetime, yet they alter the seasonal distribution of sunlight across entire hemispheres. In northern Africa, even a relatively modest change in summer heating can shift the boundary between desert and grassland by hundreds of kilometers. The most important rhythm for the early Holocene Sahara is the precession of Earth's axis, roughly every 23,000 years. The wobble changes the time of year when Earth passes closest to the Sun. Near the end of the last ice age and into the early Holocene, Northern Hemisphere summers received stronger solar radiation than they do today. The sunlight did not simply make the air warmer, it intensified the contrast between the rapidly heating African landmass and the cooler Atlantic Ocean. That contrast drives the West African monsoon. As land warms, air rises, lower pressure forms over the continent, drawing moist air inland from the ocean. Today, this system carries seasonal rain across tropical West Africa and into the Sahel, but its northern reach is limited. When summer heating was stronger, the atmospheric circulation became more powerful. The rain belt moved farther north. Moisture penetrated regions that now receive almost none. The desert did not turn green because rainfall appeared from nowhere. The machinery of the monsoon already existed. What changed was its strength, reach, and persistence. Storm systems traveled deeper into the continent. Mountain ranges forced humid air upward, producing additional rain. Valleys collected runoff. Basins began to fill. Dry channels flowed again. In places where the change crossed a critical threshold, scattered rainfall became a connected hydrological world. This transition began after the coldest and driest phase near the last glacial maximum, but it was neither immediate nor smooth. Around 20,000 BCE, much of northern Africa remained extremely arid. Vast dune fields were active, and dust moved across the continent and out over the Atlantic. The global climate was colder. Large ice sheets covered northern lands, and sea levels were far lower. Tropical rain belts were displaced, while many Saharan regions offered only limited and isolated refuges. As the Ice Age weakened, temperatures rose and atmospheric circulation reorganized. By roughly 14,800 years before the present, conditions across parts of northern Africa began shifting toward the humid regime usually associated with the African Humid Period. This date should not be imagined as the moment when the entire Sahara suddenly became green. Some lakes expanded earlier than others. Certain regions remained dry for centuries or millennia. Local topography, groundwater, soil, vegetation, and distance from moisture sources all shaped the response. Yet the overall movement was unmistakable. Rain advanced northward, and with it came grass, shrubs, trees, wetlands, and animals. Water reached basins that had been dry for generations. The transformation gained momentum because the climate system responded not only to sunlight but also to the changing land itself. A bright desert reflects a large share of incoming solar energy back into the atmosphere. This high reflectivity, known as albedo, helps keep the surface relatively cool and discourages the rising air that draws moisture inland. Vegetation changes that balance. Darker grasses and shrubs absorb more sunlight. Their roots alter the soil, their leaves release water vapor, the roughened surface slows winds and affects the exchange of heat between land and atmosphere. As vegetation spreads, the land can become more favorable to further rainfall. Dust adds another layer. A dry Sahara produces enormous quantities of airborne mineral particles. These particles influence sunlight, clouds, ocean nutrients, and atmospheric heating. When rain dampens the surface and vegetation stabilizes the soil, dust emissions decline. That reduction can further alter regional climate in ways that support a wetter landscape. The Sahara's transformation was therefore not merely the passive result of additional rain. Rain changed the land, and the changed land could reinforce the rain. Climate models often struggle to recreate the full extent of the Green Sahara without including these interactions. Orbital forcing provides the initial push, but vegetation, soil moisture, lakes, wetlands, and dust help explain how the response became so large. The system behaves less like a simple faucet being opened and more like a landscape crossing from one state into another. The result was not a single type of environment. New reconstructions combining paleoclimate simulations with machine learning suggest a shifting mosaic across space and time. Savanna expanded through some regions. Shrublands occupied others. Vegetation followed river corridors and mountain slopes while remaining sparse on certain plains. Lakes created local zones of moisture that outlasted nearby grasslands. The green world moved, thickened, fragmented, and retreated according to rainfall patterns that varied from one basin to the next. Northern Africa also received moisture from more than one atmospheric source. The tropical monsoon was central, but Mediterranean systems and westerly winds could influence the northern margins and mountain regions. New cave records from Tunisia show that wet and dry intervals across the last 300,000 years were shaped by complex interactions among orbital conditions, monsoon strength, and rainfall arriving from the north. The Sahara had breathed in and out before. The early Holocene humid period was dramatic, but it was not unique in deep time. Stalagmites preserve that older rhythm in layers of mineral deposited drop by drop. When water seeps through rock into a cave, it carries chemical signatures of the climate above. Periods of growth show when rainfall reached places that are now too dry for such formations to develop. These records reveal repeated multimillennial wet phases separated by long arid intervals. What appears permanent on a modern map is instead part of a climate system capable of reversing itself again and again. Even during the famous humid period, however, rain was never perfectly reliable. The monsoon had seasons. Lakes rose and fell. Rivers could flood intensely in one decade and weaken in another. The idea of a uniformly gentle climate is contradicted by records of extreme rainfall in the Tibesti Mountains and unusually powerful Nile floods farther east. A greener Sahara could also be a volatile Sahara, with storms, sudden runoff, overflowing basins, and long intervals when communities waited for rain that arrived late. This instability would become increasingly important. A climate system strengthened by feedbacks can also be vulnerable when those feedbacks weaken. If rainfall decreases, vegetation thins. Exposed soil produces more dust. The surface becomes more reflective. Evaporation patterns change, and monsoon circulation may weaken further. The same processes that helped build the green landscape could contribute to its eventual retreat. But that ending still lay thousands of years ahead. During the stronger phases of the African Humid Period, especially between roughly 9,000 and 6,000 years before the present, Northern Africa entered a state almost impossible to reconcile with its modern appearance. Rain fell over the central Sahara. Deep lakes occupied volcanic craters in Tibesti. Wetlands spread through low basins. Mega Chad expanded across an immense region. Rivers carried water toward the Atlantic, the Nile, and interior depressions. The orbital change that began the process was almost imperceptible. No single summer announced that a desert was ending. No generation watched the entire transformation from beginning to completion. People experienced local signs, more frequent storms, fuller springs, grass returning to familiar valleys, animals appearing where they'd been rare, and water lingering longer after the rainy season. Over centuries, those signs accumulated until a different world stood where the desert had been. Sunlight had shifted by degrees. The monsoon had followed, the land responded and then amplified the change. From that interaction came rivers, lakes, migrations, and entire human lifeways that would leave their traces beneath the sand. Yet before people could enter this expanding landscape in large numbers, the New World first had to take shape basin by basin, shoreline by shoreline, leaving behind the evidence through which it would one day be found again. The world that emerged from this climatic shift has no surviving map drawn by those who lived within it. Its rivers have vanished, its shorelines lie stranded, and many of its settlements rest beneath dunes, salt flats, or modern desert pavement. Reconstructing it requires a different kind of cartography, one assembled from fragments that were never meant to become evidence. A grain of pollen, a layer of lake mud, a buried channel, or the shell of a microscopic alga may preserve more about the vanished Sahara than an entire exposed landscape. For much of modern history, explorers could recognize only the most obvious clues. They found fish remains in dry country, water-worn stones far from rivers, and rock art showing animals that could not survive in the present desert. These discoveries suggested a wetter past, but they could not reveal its full scale or timing. The transformation became clearer when scientists began examining the Sahara from above and below at the same time. Satellite imagery changed what could be seen. Ordinary photographs revealed dunes, mountains, gravel plains, and salt basins, but radar can detect differences hidden beneath loose sand. In Western Sahara, branching structures emerged where no rivers appeared on the surface. Their shapes were too organized to be accidental. Smaller channels joined larger ones. Curves followed the natural fall of the terrain. Broad valleys led toward the Atlantic coast. Together they formed the skeleton of an ancient drainage network. Radar does not simply look through the desert as though the sand were transparent. It records how signals interact with materials of different density, texture, and moisture history. Sediments packed into an old riverbed may respond differently from wind-blown dunes above them. The resulting images allow researchers to trace channels that have been buried for thousands of years, though their exact age and activity must still be tested using other evidence. That testing often continues far from the vanished river itself. Off the Atlantic coast, cores drilled from the seafloor contain layers of sediment washed out of Africa. Minerals carry geological fingerprints linked to particular regions inland. When a major river system flowed, it transported material from distant highlands and deposited it in the ocean. When the climate dried and the river weakened, the character of those deposits changed. The seabed therefore preserves a record of water crossing the continent even after the channel on land disappeared. Lake basins offer an even more detailed archive. Mud settles slowly at the bottom of a lake, trapping pollen, dust, algae, charcoal, shells, and chemical traces from the surrounding environment. A core extracted from this sediment is a vertical timeline. The upper layers are younger. Deeper layers belong to older worlds. Their colours, textures, and contents shift as a lake rises, shrinks, freshens, or becomes salty. Some records are coarse, blending decades or centuries into a single layer. Others are astonishingly precise. At Lake Yoa in northern Chad, sediments formed annual layers that can be read almost like pages in a book. Each pair of seasonal deposits records 1 year. By counting and analysing them, researchers can identify not only long humid phases but shorter disruptions that would otherwise vanish into averages. These layers show that the African Humid Period was repeatedly interrupted by severe droughts lasting years or decades. Dry episodes around 9,300 and 8,200 years before the present, with another possible event near 6,300 years ago, disturbed the green landscape long before its final collapse. The significance is easy to miss. A lake may survive a drought and still appear continuous in a broad geological record. Yet the people and animals depending on its margins would have experienced falling water, failed grazing, exposed mud, and uncertain seasons. A landscape can therefore look stable when viewed across 1,000 years, while remaining dangerously unpredictable within a human life. The evidence from Lake Yoa makes the Green Sahara more realistic and more unsettling. It was not an endless wet paradise. It was a living system capable of sudden interruption. Other lakes preserve different pieces of the story. In the Tibesti Mountains, volcanic craters collected rainfall and runoff. Their sediments contain the remains of diatoms, microscopic algae whose species vary according to water depth, salinity, and chemistry. Some thrive in deep fresh water. Others tolerate shallow or increasingly salty conditions. Their durable shells remain after the organisms die, forming an ecological record of lakes that no longer exist. Oxygen isotopes provide another measure. Water containing lighter isotopes evaporates more readily, while heavier forms become concentrated as a lake shrinks. Changes in the ratio preserved in minerals or biological remains can reveal shifts in rainfall and evaporation. Combined with diatoms, shoreline deposits, and basin geometry, these chemical clues help estimate whether a lake was deep and stable, shallow and seasonal, or approaching desiccation. Pollen expands the view beyond the water. Plants release enormous quantities of pollen, and some grains settle into lake mud or protected soils. Their outer walls can survive for thousands of years. Under a microscope, grains from grasses, shrubs, trees, and wetland plants have distinctive forms. A changing mixture allows researchers to follow vegetation advancing into the desert and later withdrawing from it. The interpretation is not always simple. Pollen can travel great distances on the wind. A lake may receive grains from local reeds, distant savanna, and mountain forests at the same time. Different plants produce unequal amounts. Some species leave abundant traces, while others are nearly invisible. Scholars still debate the exact density and distribution of vegetation in many areas, but broad patterns emerge when pollen is combined with plant waxes, charcoal, fossils, and climate models. Animal remains add movement and habitat to the reconstruction. Fish bones in dry basins reveal aquatic connections. Hippo and crocodile remains indicate bodies of water that persisted long enough to support large animals. Antelope, giraffes, cattle, and elephants point toward grasslands and wooded savanna. Mollusk shells record changing shorelines. Even small creatures matter, because species differ in their tolerance for dryness, temperature, and seasonal water. Human evidence helps anchor these environmental records in lived time. Stone tools, pottery fragments, hearths, burials, and rock art appear along former lakes and river corridors. Their distribution shows where people returned repeatedly and where occupation ended. Yet archaeological absence must be treated carefully. A place without known artifacts may never have been inhabited, or its remains may lie buried beyond detection. Sand can conceal an entire settlement, while erosion destroys another completely. Computer models now bring these scattered records together. Paleoclimate simulations calculate how orbital changes, sea temperatures, vegetation, dust, and atmospheric circulation may have altered rainfall. Machine learning methods can compare model outputs with fossil and sediment evidence to estimate how vegetation changed across space and time. These reconstructions do not produce a perfect photograph of the past. They create a range of plausible landscapes constrained by what survives. The picture that emerges is dynamic. Grasslands expand northward along some routes while dry zones persist elsewhere. Lakes grow rapidly, stabilize, and contract. Mountain regions hold water after surrounding plains begin drying. River corridors become green arteries through more open country. The Sahara is neither uniformly wet nor uniformly dry, but divided into ecological provinces that shift from century to century. That complexity is why no single discovery can explain the whole region. A deep lake in Chad does not prove equal rainfall in Morocco. A river in western Sahara may have flowed when another basin remained closed. A humid interval preserved in a Tunisian cave may reflect Mediterranean rainfall as well as the tropical monsoon. The evidence remains incomplete, and every reconstruction contains gaps. Still, the fragments agree on the central transformation. Water returned on a continental scale, rivers reactivated, basins filled, vegetation advanced into regions now barren. The Sahara became habitable not as one continuous garden, but as an immense network of lakes, grasslands, wetlands, springs, and corridors separated by harsher ground. Seen through these records, the desert begins to resemble a palimpsest, a surface written over many times without fully erasing what came before. Satellite images reveal the buried lines, sediment cores restore the sequence, pollen supplies the vegetation, fossils return the animals, archaeology places people at the water's edge, layer by layer. The empty map fills until the vanished landscape becomes visible again, not as a legend of a lost paradise, but as a real and unstable world whose waters once spread across distances large enough to create inland seas. Some of the waters that filled the Green Sahara were not small lakes scattered between dunes. They were vast inland systems with shorelines extending beyond the horizon, fed by rivers, seasonal floods, groundwater, and mountain runoff. In a landscape now associated with scarcity, water once gathered on a scale large enough to reshape migration, wildlife, and human settlement across northern Africa. The greatest example was Lake Mega-Chad. Today, Lake Chad is shallow, fragmented, and highly sensitive to rainfall, but during wetter periods its basin held an enormous body of water. At its largest Holocene extent, the lake covered much of the modern Chad basin and reached into areas now divided among Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Its precise size changed repeatedly, and scholars continue to refine the timing of its maximum shoreline. But the surviving evidence indicates a lake larger than many modern countries. Its ancient boundary can still be traced across the land. Ridges of sand and sediment mark beaches built by waves. Shells lie in places now far from permanent water. Old deltas show where rivers entered the basin. In some regions, the shoreline stands so clearly above the surrounding plain that it resembles the edge of a vanished sea. Yet what survives is only the outline. The living surface, the reflected sky, the reeds, the fish, The boats, the storms moving across open water is gone. Mega Chad was not a single unchanging lake. Water levels rose and fell as rainfall shifted. At times, the basin may have divided into separate bodies of water. At others, expanding waters joined lowlands into a broad connected system. Overflow could escape through channels toward the Benue River and eventually the Niger, linking the interior basin to distant drainage networks. This possibility is important because it suggests that fish, aquatic plants, and perhaps human travelers could move through routes that no longer exist. The idea of an inland lake sending water toward another major river seems almost impossible in the modern landscape. But old channels preserve the geometry of that connection. A basin now famous for evaporation once held enough water to spill outward. The Sahara and Sahel were not merely dotted with isolated lakes. At their wettest, they formed interacting hydrological systems. Farther north, the Tibesti Mountains rose like an island of rock in the central Sahara. Their volcanic peaks captured moisture carried deep into the continent by the strengthened monsoon. Rain falling on high slopes rushed through gullies and collected inside crater basins. Some of these depressions became deep lakes, held within walls formed by ancient eruptions. The image is striking dark volcanic rims surrounding blue water, with grasses and shrubs spreading across nearby slopes, while storms gathered above peaks that now stand over one of the driest places on Earth. Recent evidence indicates that mid-Holocene rainfall in Tibesti could be extremely intense. The region did not merely receive a gentle increase in seasonal moisture. At times, powerful precipitation events filled crater lakes and sent runoff through mountain valleys. These lakes preserved unusually detailed environmental records. Diatoms lived within their waters, each species suited to particular conditions. Their fossil shells reveal whether the lakes were fresh, deep, shallow, or increasingly saline. Chemical evidence tracks evaporation. Sediments record periods when runoff carried material from surrounding slopes. Together they show lakes responding to a climate that could be wet but highly variable. Mountain lakes also acted as refuges. When rainfall weakened on the surrounding plains, water could persist longer at elevation or within deep crater basins. Animals and people may have returned to these places during dry intervals, although the archaeological evidence is uneven. The mountains were not isolated from the broader Green Sahara. They were reservoirs, landmarks, and sources of water feeding lower country. To the west, river systems carried runoff across enormous distances. The Tamanrasset drainage gathered water from parts of the Hoggar Highlands and surrounding regions before flowing toward the Atlantic. Its network included tributaries, valleys, and floodplains that would have changed seasonally. During strong rains, channels expanded and sediment moved rapidly downstream. During drier months, flow may have weakened into pools or separated reaches. No single reconstruction can show exactly how the river looked at every stage. It may not have resembled a permanently full tropical river across its entire length. Some sections could have flowed seasonally, while groundwater sustained others. Yet marine sediments deposited beyond the coast demonstrate that the system transported material from deep inside the continent. Water crossed the Western Sahara strongly enough to leave a geological signature in the ocean. Elsewhere, closed basins filled without any outlet to the sea. These lakes depended on the balance between rainfall, incoming rivers, groundwater, and evaporation. When inflow exceeded water loss, shorelines advanced. When rain failed, they retreated quickly. Shallow lakes could expand across huge areas and then shrink dramatically within a few decades. That instability shaped the surrounding environment. A rising lake flooded grassland and created new wetlands. Receding water exposed nutrient-rich mud where plants could grow. Fish populations expanded during connected phases and became trapped when channels closed. Birds followed seasonal water. Large mammals gathered at reliable shorelines, while predators followed them. Human camps shifted as fishing grounds, grazing areas, and freshwater access changed. Lakes created their own local climates. Open water increased humidity and moderated temperature nearby. Reeds and aquatic vegetation stabilized shores. Evaporation fed clouds and may have encouraged local rainfall, though the strength of this effect remains debated. A large lake could turn an otherwise open basin into a complex ecological zone of marshes, beaches, channels, wooded margins, and seasonal floodplains. One lesser-known consequence of these expanding waters was the movement of aquatic species into the desert interior. Fish bones found in now dry regions show that populations reach basins far from modern rivers. Some species could travel only if waterways connected during humid phases. Their remains are therefore biological maps of vanished channels. A fish skeleton in the sand may reveal a former river link as clearly as a buried valley. Crocodiles and hippos provide even more dramatic evidence. Both require substantial water, though they can tolerate seasonal variation under favourable conditions. Their presence deep within the Sahara means that lakes and rivers persisted long enough to support breeding populations and connected habitats. These were not animals wandering briefly into a wet depression after a storm. They belonged to functioning aquatic ecosystems. Yet the lakes were not uniformly safe or stable. Intense rainfall could produce destructive floods. Sudden runoff from mountains carried debris and transformed channels. Shorelines shifted, sometimes abandoning camps or covering familiar ground. Strong winds generated waves across broad lakes. As water levels fell, salinity increased, fish habitats contracted, and competition concentrated around remaining sources. The Nile also responded to the wider humid system. During the North African Humid Period, its floods could vary sharply from decade to decade. Sediments preserve evidence of extreme flood episodes between roughly 9,500 and 8,000 years before the present. These floods reflected changing rainfall across distant catchments, especially the Ethiopian highlands and equatorial regions, but they formed part of the same broad reorganization of African climate. Water-linked places separated by thousands of kilometers. Rain in highlands became river flow in lowlands. A storm over Tibesti filled a crater and fed valleys below. Monsoon changes influenced Lake Chad, western rivers, Saharan wetlands, and Nile floods in different ways. The Green Sahara was therefore not one lake or one river system. It was a continent-wide web of water with many rhythms. What survives in the record suggests that people living beside these waters would have known landscapes unlike anything visible there today. They would have watched shorelines move with the seasons, followed fish into shallow bays, crossed channels, and recognized distant mountains as sources of rain. The largest lakes may have appeared permanent, older and more reliable than any human memory. But their permanence was an illusion created by scale. Even Megachad depended on rainfall. Even deep crater lakes responded to evaporation. Even great rivers could weaken when the monsoon shifted. The waters seemed immense because they filled entire horizons, yet they remained vulnerable to forces operating far beyond the shoreline. For thousands of years, however, they endured long enough to transform the desert into a world of movement and abundance. Rivers spread sediment across floodplains. Wetlands thickened around shallow basins. Lakes became centers of life. Along their margins, animals gathered in numbers difficult to imagine now, and the Sahara filled with species whose bones and images would become some of the clearest witnesses to the vanished green world. The animals came because the water had remade everything around it. Grass spread across floodplains. Acacia and other drought-tolerant trees occupied better-watered ground. Reeds crowded shallow margins, while shrubs and woodland patches followed valleys and mountain slopes. The Sahara was not transformed into a single endless meadow, but across many regions it became open enough, wet enough, and productive enough to support herds of large animals whose modern ranges now lie far to the south. Elephants move through these landscapes, feeding on grasses, bark, leaves, and branches. Giraffes browsed from scattered trees. Antelope crossed open ground in seasonal groups. Wild cattle grazed near lakes and river corridors. Hippopotamuses occupied deep water and broad channels. Crocodiles waited in marshes and river bends. Fish-filled lakes that now survive only as salt pans or shallow depressions. The Sahara held not merely a collection of displaced species, but functioning ecosystems in which water, vegetation, predators, scavengers, and migrating herbivores were bound together. Rock engravings preserve some of the most immediate evidence. Across the central Sahara, stone surfaces carry images of elephants, giraffes, rhinoceroses, ostriches, antelope, wild cattle, crocodiles, and other animals. Some are rendered with careful attention to body shape and posture. Others are stylized or layered over older images. They're not zoological field guides, and their dates are often difficult to establish precisely. But they show that artists knew these animals as living presences rather than distant legends. A giraffe carved into stone in the middle of today's desert is more than an artistic surprise. It implies trees or tall shrubs sufficient to support browsing animals, open space for movement, and reliable access to water. A hippopotamus image implies something different: deep pools, rivers, or lakes, large enough to sustain an animal that spends much of its life in water. When such images appear alongside fish remains, shells, wetland sediments, and ancient shorelines, the vanished ecosystem becomes harder to dismiss as exaggeration. Elephants would have altered that ecosystem wherever they travelled. They break branches, open woodland, spread seeds, dig into dry ground for water, and create paths used by other animals. Their presence can reshape vegetation over large areas. In a greener Sahara, elephants were not simply inhabitants of the landscape, they were engineers within it. A herd moving along a river corridor could change the structure of the surrounding plant life and help maintain the patchwork of grassland and woodland. Hippos also transformed their environment. By feeding on land at night and returning to water during the day, they moved nutrients between grasslands and lakes. Their paths cut through vegetation. Their waste fertilized aquatic systems, sometimes supporting food webs and sometimes reducing oxygen when concentrated in shrinking pools. This is a lesser-known reminder that large animals do not merely occupy habitats. They alter the chemistry and physical structure of the places they use. The lakes supported fish communities diverse enough to become a major human resource later in the humid period. Species distribution suggests that some basins were connected by rivers or flood channels, at least intermittently. Fish cannot cross hundreds of kilometers of dry land, so their remains trace routes that water once followed. In some areas, the biological evidence may preserve connections that have left only faint geological marks. Birds would have been equally abundant, though their remains are less dramatic. Wetlands attract waterfowl, waders, and migratory species travelling between continents. Seasonal lakes could become immense feeding grounds. Ostriches occupied drier grasslands nearby, while raptors followed smaller animals and carrion. The sky above the Green Sahara may at times have been as crowded and mobile as the ground below. Predators moved with the herds. Lions likely hunted along grasslands and water margins. Hyenas scavenged and hunted across broad territories. Smaller carnivores occupied reeds, rocky ground, and open plains. Crocodiles controlled river edges, especially where animals crossed or came to drink. The image of the Green Sahara as peaceful abundance is therefore incomplete. It was productive, but productivity sustains danger as well as life. Seasonality governed much of this world. Rain did not fall evenly throughout the year. Grass could flourish after monsoon storms and then dry. Herds followed the changing distribution of pasture. Animals moved toward permanent lakes during dry months and dispersed when seasonal pools returned. River floodplains offered fresh growth after waters receded. A landscape that looked richly green at one point in the year could become brown, dusty, and tense several months later. Even during the wetter millennia, drought could disrupt these patterns. The decadal dry episodes recorded at Lake Yoa would have reduced pasture, lowered water levels, and concentrated animals around surviving sources. Large herbivores may have migrated farther or suffered local population declines. Predators would have followed them. Aquatic species trapped in shallow basins faced warming water and rising salinity. No single explanation fully accounts for how each ecosystem responded, because different species and regions had different tolerances. The Sahara's geography created refuges. Mountain ranges such as Tibesti and the Hoggar could retain water longer than the exposed plains. Deep lakes endured after shallow wetlands vanished. River valleys remained greener than surrounding uplands. During difficult decades, animals may have compressed into these zones, then spread outward again when rain returned. Such repeated contraction and expansion helps explain how species could persist through a climate that was humid in the long term but unstable in the short term. The vegetation itself remains a subject of debate. Older popular images sometimes show nearly the entire Sahara covered in dense green savanna. Newer reconstructions are more cautious. Some areas probably supported continuous grassland, while others remained sparsely vegetated or desert-like. Local soil, elevation, rainfall seasonality, and groundwater created sharp contrasts. A person could travel from wetland to open grassland, then into dry gravel country without leaving the broader humid Sahara. That patchiness may have increased biodiversity. Different environments lay close together: lake, marsh, floodplain, grassland, shrubland, rocky upland, and mountain valley. Species adapted to different conditions could occupy neighbouring zones. Water corridors allowed movement through otherwise harsh ground. The result was a landscape of ecological edges, and edges often attract both wildlife and people. Some of the most evocative evidence comes from places where animal remains are now embedded in sediments beneath empty sky. Fish bones emerge from ancient lake beds. Mollusk shells lie along fossil beaches. Large mammal bones appear near former water sources. Each specimen is a small contradiction of the modern setting. A crocodile tooth in dry sand does not merely indicate a wetter year. It indicates a river or lake, prey populations, nesting habitat, and enough continuity for an aquatic predator to survive. Yet the record is uneven. Bone preserves better in some sediments than others. Rock art may emphasize culturally important animals rather than common ones. Some species appear abundant in images but rare in excavated remains. Others leave bones but almost no artistic trace. Scholars still debate how closely the surviving evidence reflects the actual composition of Saharan ecosystems. What can be said with confidence is that the desert once supported large, connected communities of life. Herds crossed ground now bare. Hippos entered waters that have vanished. Elephants moved between valleys. Fish travelled through channels hidden beneath dunes. Predators watched the margins of lakes broad enough to resemble seas. For human groups entering this world, the animals were not background scenery. They were food, danger, movement, memory, and information. The direction of a herd could point toward water. Bird flight could reveal distant wetlands. Fish runs marked seasonal change. Tracks showed which valley remained green. To live in the Sahara during its humid centuries was to read a landscape animated by other species, and to understand that water had turned the former desert into a world crowded with possibility. People did not enter the Green Sahara as conquerors of an empty land. They arrived gradually, following the same signs that drew animals across the changing continent fuller springs. Greener valleys, birds moving toward water, and herds appearing where open desert had once blocked passage. The humid transformation created opportunity, but it also created uncertainty. A lake visible one season might shrink the next. A river valley could offer rich pasture and fish, then become difficult during a prolonged dry spell. Movement was not simply wandering. It was a form of knowledge. Near the end of the Ice Age, much of the Sahara remained too dry for continuous occupation. Human groups lived around its margins and within scattered refuges where groundwater, springs, mountains, or river systems made survival possible. Fossil spring records from central Sudan suggest that small zones of reliable water could sustain settlement and movement even before the main humid phase reached its height. These places were not broad green corridors yet. They were islands of possibility separated by severe country. As rainfall strengthened after roughly 14,800 years before the present, those islands began to connect. Seasonal pools lasted longer. River channels carried runoff farther. Grass expanded into valleys that had supported little vegetation. Animals followed, and people followed them. The Sahara was becoming passable in ways that had not been possible for generations. The first movements into newly habitable regions were probably flexible and cautious. Hunter-gatherers did not need to believe that the climate had changed permanently. They needed only to know that a particular basin held water, that fish could be taken from a certain shore, or that a valley remained green during the dry season. Familiar routes extended outward. Camps appeared near lakes. People returned to productive locations, perhaps first for part of the year and later for longer periods. Archaeology rarely preserves the earliest moment of such movement. A temporary camp may leave only scattered stone flakes, burned bone, or a hearth later erased by wind. Rising lakes can submerge sites, while retreating shorelines expose them to erosion. Dunes cover some occupations and strip others away. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern of settlement around former water sources shows that people repeatedly entered the interior as the humid landscape expanded. Their technology was suited to mobility. Stone tools could be carried, repaired, and reshaped. Points and cutting edges supported hunting and butchery. Scrapers processed hides and plant materials. Grinding stones became increasingly important in some regions, suggesting the collection and preparation of seeds, grasses, and other plant foods. Bone tools, fishing equipment, and pottery later added new possibilities. But the most essential tool remained environmental understanding. A mobile group needed to know where water persisted after rain stopped. It needed to recognize animal trails, edible plants, dangerous crossings, and signs of approaching weather. The Sahara's scale made mistakes costly. Even during humid centuries, dry stretches remained between lakes and valleys. The landscape was greener, not uniformly forgiving. People may have moved along river corridors that functioned as natural roads. A flowing channel provided drinking water, fish, plants, and recognizable direction. Vegetation along its banks made the route visible from a distance. Tributaries led toward highlands, while downstream travel opened access to broader basins and coastlines. The reactivated Tamanrasset system in the west may have created one such corridor, although scholars still debate how continuously its different branches flowed during particular periods. In the central Sahara, mountains served as anchors. The Tibetan Hoggar ranges collected rain, supported springs, and provided elevated refuges during difficult seasons. Their silhouettes could be seen across great distances. Valleys radiating from them guided movement toward plains and basins. Rock shelters offered protection from heat, wind, and storms, while nearby water attracted animals. Lakes drew people for different reasons. Their shores concentrated resources. Fish could be caught with hooks, harpoons, nets, traps, or techniques that left little archaeological trace. Mollusks could be gathered in shallow water. Reeds supplied material for mats, baskets, shelters, and perhaps watercraft. Birds and animals visited predictable locations. Wet mud preserved tracks that revealed what had passed during the night. The shoreline itself was constantly changing. A camp established near water could be stranded as a lake retreated or flooded when the lake rose. People learned to occupy terraces and ridges above seasonal limits. They returned to older camps when conditions improved and abandoned them when water became too salty, shallow, or unreliable. Over time, these repeated movements created dense archaeological zones around the margins of vanished lakes. The Green Sahara also opened routes between regions that modern geography seems to divide. North Africa, the Nile Valley, the Sahel, and sub-Saharan Africa became more connected through chains of water and grassland. Movement did not necessarily occur as one great migration. It could unfold through generations of local travel, marriage, exchange, and shifting seasonal ranges. Objects, techniques, and genetic lineages moved because people moved. The ancient genomes recovered from Takarkori in southwestern Libya reveal how complex this human geography was. The two women whose remains were studied lived around 7,000 years ago, during the later Green Sahara. Their ancestry points to a deeply rooted North African lineage that had remained distinct for a long period, even while receiving some gene flow from populations south of the Sahara. This suggests that the humid landscape created contact without erasing regional identity. Their existence also changes the emotional scale of the story. The Green Sahara was not merely a corridor crossed by anonymous migrants. It was home. People lived within it long enough to develop local traditions, bury their dead, manage animals, and pass knowledge between generations. The desert interior was not a temporary road between more important places. For many communities, it was the center of the known world. What they call themselves is lost. Their languages are unknown. Their social boundaries cannot be reconstructed from a few tools or burials. Archaeologists use material traditions to identify patterns, but similar pottery does not always mean a single people, and different tools do not necessarily mark hostile groups. Scholars still debate how many distinct communities occupied the Sahara and how they related to one another. Yet movement left clues. Stone materials sometimes came from distant geological sources, showing that objects or people travelled far. Decorative styles appeared across broad areas. fishing technologies spread between basins. Livestock later moved through regions where wild hunting had once dominated. These connections suggest networks larger than any single camp. Travel may have followed the rhythm of rain. During wet months, groups could disperse across grasslands and exploit temporary pools. During the dry season, they gathered near permanent water. Such cycles would bring communities into repeated contact. Lake margins became meeting places where resources, information, partners, and stories could be exchanged. Drought disrupted this rhythm. The severe events around 9,300 and 8,200 years before the present likely reduced the number of dependable water sources. People may have compressed into refuges, changed routes, or temporarily abandoned entire basins. A drought lasting several decades would outlive the experience of one generation. Knowledge of former water might become memory rather than practical guidance. When rain returned, people could move back into the interior, but the landscape would not be exactly the same. Channels shifted, plant communities changed, some lakes recovered quickly, while others remained reduced. Human settlement therefore expanded and contracted with the climate, producing a history of repeated entry rather than one continuous occupation. This flexibility was the foundation of survival. The people of the Green Sahara were not passive recipients of a favorable climate. They observed, adjusted, and carried knowledge across uncertain terrain. They learned which mountains held water, which shorelines offered fish, and which valleys became dangerous when storms arrived. They understood abundance without assuming permanence. As generations settled more deeply into this water-rich world, their camps became more substantial, their tools more varied, and their relationship with lakes more intimate. The Sahara was no longer merely opening before them. It was becoming a lived landscape of routines, skills, and memory, where daily life unfolded beside waters broad enough to conceal the desert waiting beneath them. Daily life beside the Saharan lakes depended on rhythms that rarely leave clear monuments. People rose with the changing light, watched the waterline, tested the wind, repaired tools, gathered plants, tracked animals, and judged whether a camp should remain in place for another day or begin moving toward a more reliable shore. The great transformation of the Sahara becomes most understandable at this scale, not as a map turning from yellow to green, but as a sequence of ordinary decisions made beside water. Fishing was among the most important of those activities. Archaeological sites around ancient lakes contain fish bones in quantities that show aquatic food was not an occasional supplement. In some places, fishing became a central part of subsistence. Large species could be taken from deeper channels, while smaller fish were collected from shallow margins, seasonal pools, and shrinking lagoons where they became easier to catch. Harpoons made from bone are among the most distinctive tools associated with early Holocene fishing communities in northern Africa. Their barbed points could hold in struggling fish and aquatic animals. Hooks, lines, nets, baskets, traps, and spears may also have been used, although organic materials rarely survive. A community did not need one technique. Different seasons and water conditions demanded different methods. When lakes rose, fish dispersed into flooded grasslands and wetlands. When water retreated, channels narrowed and pools became crowded. People who understood these cycles could anticipate where fish would gather. The lake itself offered food, but knowledge made that food dependable. Fish required processing. They could be roasted, dried, smoked, or perhaps preserved in ways now difficult to detect. Cutting marks and burned bone provide partial evidence, but most daily practice disappeared with the flesh. Reeds, wooden racks, and fibers used to prepare it What remains is enough to show that shoreline camps often supported repeated, organised activity rather than brief visits. Hunting continued alongside fishing. Antelope, gazelle, wild cattle, and smaller animals occupied the surrounding grasslands. Hunters read tracks, droppings, broken vegetation, and patterns of movement toward water. A lake concentrated prey, but it also concentrated danger. Crocodiles occupied the margins, hippos defended favored areas, and predators followed herds to drinking places. Approaching water required caution as well as opportunity. Stone points and cutting tools reveal some of this work. A sharp edge could serve many purposes, opening a carcass, cutting hide, shaping wood, preparing reeds, or slicing plant material. Tools were often resharpened until their original form changed completely. Stone was valuable not because it was rare everywhere, but because a dependable piece could be carried, repaired, and adapted through repeated use. The source of the stone mattered. Some camps contain materials that originated far away, indicating travel or exchange. A carefully chosen core could move across the landscape with its owner, gradually becoming smaller as flakes were removed. In this way, the life history of a tool could mirror the route of a person through lakes, valleys, and uplands. Plant foods were equally important, though they're less visible than animal bones. Wild grasses produced edible seeds, wetlands offered roots, tubers, fruits, and leafy plants. Trees and shrubs provided nuts, pods, resins, fuel, shade, and wood. Grinding stones found at some sites suggest that seeds and other plant foods were crushed or ground, perhaps into meal or paste. The use of wild grains required patience. Seeds had to be gathered at the correct stage, separated from husks, cleaned, ground, and cooked. This labour rarely appears in dramatic reconstructions, yet it may have supplied a stable part of the diet. The Green Sahara was productive because people knew how to use many resources rather than relying on a single abundant species. Water plants supplied materials as well as food. Reeds could be cut for mats, roofing, baskets, screens, or bundles. Flexible fibres could become cordage. Wood from nearby trees served as fuel and construction material. Hides provided coverings, containers, bedding, and clothing. Clay, once shaped and fired, created vessels capable of transforming how food and water were stored. Pottery became particularly important in many Saharan communities. Some of the earlier ceramics in Africa appeared among hunter-gatherers rather than settled farmers, challenging the assumption that pottery always followed agriculture. Vessels allowed people to boil fish, soften plants, render fats, carry liquids, and store food. Their surfaces were often decorated with impressions made by combs, cords, or other tools, leaving patterns that archaeologists used to trace traditions and contact. A broken pot is more than discarded household debris. Its clay may reveal where it was made. Residues absorbed into its walls can preserve traces of what it once contained. Decorative styles may connect distant communities, although scholars still debate whether shared designs represent migrating people, exchanged objects, copied ideas, or some combination of all three. Shelters were probably built from materials that vanished quickly. Poles, branches, reeds, mats, and hides could create structures suited to seasonal camps. Some may have been light enough to dismantle or rebuild. Others stood in places occupied repeatedly. Stone settings, post holes, hearths, and compacted surfaces sometimes reveal their outlines, but most architecture of daily life has returned to soil. Camp placement followed practical needs. People wanted access to water without living directly in the path of floods. Slightly raised ground offered protection from rising shorelines, insects, and damp soil. Nearby reeds could provide material, while open views helped detect animals approaching the water. Shade mattered in hotter months, and shelter from wind became important on exposed shores. Hearths organized much of the camp. Around fire, food was cooked, tools were repaired, and light extended activity beyond sunset. Smoke discouraged insects and helped preserve food. Ash, charcoal, burned stone, and bone are among the most common traces left behind. But the social meaning of the hearth is harder to recover. It was a centre of work, warmth, information, and memory. A shoreline camp was rarely silent. Stone struck stone. Fish were cleaned. Reeds moved in the wind. Birds gathered over shallow water. People crossed between the hearth, the lake, storage areas, and working spaces. The camp changed throughout the day as tasks shifted with temperature, light, and animal activity. Communities were probably flexible in size. Small groups could travel efficiently and exploit scattered resources. Larger gatherings may have formed at especially productive lakes or during seasons of abundance. Such meetings allowed exchange, cooperation, and the renewal of social ties. They also created pressure on local resources, making timing and mobility essential. The archaeological record cannot fully reveal how labour was divided, how decisions were made, or how status operated within these groups. Objects do not speak clearly about every relationship. It is possible to infer repeated cooperation from fishing, hunting, food processing, construction, and movement, but the exact social organization remains uncertain. Burials show that some places held meaning beyond immediate survival. People returned to particular shelters, ridges, and lake margins to place the dead within familiar landscapes. At Takarkori and other Saharan sites, burial practices suggest attachment to place even among communities that remained mobile. A camp could be temporary in occupation, yet permanent in memory. This attachment did not eliminate movement. Seasonal mobility remained a strength. People followed changing resources, visited known springs, moved livestock later in the humid period, and returned to camps whose locations had been preserved through oral knowledge. The landscape was mapped through experience rather than fixed boundaries. A lake might be a fishing ground during one season, a gathering place during another, and a dangerous shrinking basin during drought. A valley rich in pasture could later become a corridor toward refuge. Daily life therefore depended on reading change before it became crisis. What survives in the record suggests communities highly skilled at combining resources. Fish, wild plants, hunted animals, gathered shellfish, and later livestock formed overlapping strategies. No single food source had to carry the full burden of survival. Diversity was protection against uncertainty. Yet abundance could encourage deeper attachment. As camps became familiar and water remained available across generations, people invested more in vessels, grinding equipment, storage, burial grounds, and social landscapes tied to particular places. The Sahara was still a world of movement, but movement now connected homes rather than passing through emptiness. Along those lake margins, people built lives from materials that seemed temporary: reeds, wood, hide, clay, bone, and stone. Most of it disappeared. The surviving fragments are small, but together they reveal a world of practical intelligence and repeated return. People were not simply surviving beside ancient waters. They were shaping routines, communities, and traditions around them, leaving patterns that would later endure most clearly not in tools or bones, but in images placed on the stone walls of the desert itself. The stone walls of the Sahara hold a second archive, one created not by sediment, pollen, or fossil shells, but by human hands. Across the central and eastern desert, on cliffs, boulders, cave walls, and sheltered overhangs, people carved and painted the animals, bodies, tools, and movements of a world that no longer exists. They were made across thousands of years, in different regions, by communities with different traditions. Some have faded into outlines. Together they preserve a human memory of water where the modern landscape offers almost none. The most famous panels show creatures now associated with wetter climates far to the south. Giraffes stretch their long necks above smaller figures. Elephants appear in profile, sometimes massive enough to dominate an entire rock face. Rhinoceroses, wild cattle, antelope, ostriches, crocodiles, and hippopotamuses enter the same visual world. Their presence confirms what bones and sediments already suggest. But rock art adds something geological evidence cannot. These animals were watched, remembered, and selected for representation. The artists were not merely copying a bestiary. They recorded posture, motion, herd behavior, and relationships between species and people. Some animals are shown running, others stand in groups or face human figures. Cattle appear with carefully drawn horns, decorated bodies, or attendants nearby. In certain regions, scenes seem crowded with movement, while others isolate a single animal in a way that gives it unusual weight. An image could refer to hunting, ritual, identity, memory, territory, or something for which no modern category is adequate. Dating the art is one of the great difficulties. Mineral pigments rarely contain material suitable for direct radiocarbon analysis. Carved lines can be weathered but not easily assigned to an exact year. Researchers rely on superimposition, style, archaeological context, surface chemistry, and the animals or objects depicted. If one image lies beneath another, it is older. If a species belong to a wetter phase, that offers a broad environmental clue, though not a precise date. Older classifications often divided Saharan rock art into named periods based on dominant subjects, such as large wild animals, pastoral cattle, horses, and later camels. These categories remain useful, but scholars still debate their boundaries and chronology. A style may persist longer in one region than another. Cattle imagery does not appear everywhere at once. Wild animals may continue to be depicted after herding begins. The art reflects overlapping lifeways, not a clean procession of separate ages. Among the most haunting images are the so-called swimmers from the Gilf Kabir region, especially those associated with the Cave of Swimmers. Small human figures appear suspended in poses that resemble swimming, floating, or moving through an imagined space. Popular accounts often treat them as direct proof of a nearby lake. The interpretation is tempting, but it is not certain. The figures may represent swimming, ritual action, symbolic movement, or something entirely different. No single explanation fully accounts for the scene. That ambiguity matters because rock art is evidence, but it is also expression. A painted crocodile suggests familiarity with water, yet it does not tell us whether the animal lived beside the shelter, several days away, or within an ancestral story. A boat-like form may record water travel, but its identification can be disputed. Human figures with raised arms may be dancing, praying, celebrating, or enacting a ceremony whose meaning disappeared with the language of the people who made it. Even so, some scenes reveal practical details. Hunters carry bows, spears, or other equipment. Groups move beside animals. Cattle are sometimes shown under apparent control, accompanied by people or arranged in managed herds. Body decoration, hairstyles, clothing, and ornaments appear in certain traditions. These details suggest communities using art to record not only the natural world but also social identity. The landscape itself is rarely drawn in the modern sense. There are few panoramic views with rivers, hills, and trees placed together as a map. Instead, the environment is implied through the beings that depend upon it. A hippopotamus stands in for deep water. A herd of cattle implies pasture and dependable drinking places. Giraffes imply browse. Fish and crocodiles imply connected aquatic habitats. The ecology is encoded through life. Pigments had to be gathered and prepared. Ochres were crushed into powder and mixed with binders that have largely vanished. Different minerals produced reds, browns, yellows, whites, and darker tones. Brushes, fingers, pads, or other tools may have applied the paint. Engravings required repeated pecking, scraping, or incising into hard stone. Some images demanded considerable time and planning, especially when placed high on a wall or rendered at large scale. A community chose the site, the surface, the subject, and the technique. Shelters with repeated painting may have remained important across generations. New images were added beside or over older ones, creating visual layers in which the past was never completely erased. The changing subjects track the changing Sahara. Earlier scenes emphasize wild fauna suited to wetter grasslands and waterways. Later imagery increasingly centers on cattle and pastoral life. As aridity deepens, horses and wheeled vehicles appear in some regions, followed eventually by camels. Animals adapted to the desert that replaced the green world. The sequence does not read like a single universal timeline, but it captures a broad ecological transition from abundant water to increasing dryness. Cattle imagery is especially revealing because it marks more than the arrival of a new animal. Herding reorganized human movement, diet, labor, and social relationships. Animals became mobile stores of wealth and food. Their need for pasture and water shaped seasonal routes. Their bodies entered ritual and identity. When cattle dominate a wall once filled with wild animals, the image suggests a new relationship between people and the landscape. Some panels appear almost ceremonial. Human figures wear elaborate forms or stand in arranged groups. Animals may be exaggerated, decorated, or placed in compositions that seem too deliberate to be simple records of daily activity. Scholars still debate whether these scenes represent trance, ritual performance, myth, social display, or combinations of these. The evidence remains incomplete because meaning does not fossilize. There is also no reason to assume that every image was meant for every viewer. Some were placed in open areas visible to travelers. Others lie deep inside shelters or in locations requiring effort to reach. Certain panels may have marked territory, gatherings, sacred places, seasonal routes, or memories shared only within a community. The desert preserves the image but not the audience. Winder braids expose surfaces. Salt crystals break pigment from stone. Sand scours lower walls. Human activity has damaged or removed some panels. Countless paintings may have vanished entirely. Yet even that fragmentary record is extraordinary. It allows the Green Sahara to be seen through human perception. Sediment cores tell us when lakes rose, bones identify animals, DNA reveals ancestry. Rock art shows which beings people chose to remember and how they placed themselves among them. A painted giraffe, a line of cattle, a human figure with lifted arms, or a possible swimmer preserves a moment when the Sahara was not imagined as desert. Water, animals, and human movement belong to the same lived world. The images remain after the climate that gave them meaning has disappeared. As the centuries passed, the walls changed with the land. Wild herds still appeared, but managed cattle became increasingly central. The art begins to show a society no longer depending only on what the green world offered, but attempting to carry food, wealth, and survival across it on the hoof. That shift would become one of the most important adaptations in Saharan history, especially when the rains began to fail. Cattle changed the meaning of movement across the Green Sahara. Hunters followed animals that belonged to no one and could disappear beyond the horizon. Pastoralists moved with animals whose survival had become tied to their own. A herd offered meat, milk, hides, bone, dung, status, and security, but it also created obligation. Cattle had to be watered, protected, guided toward pasture, and kept alive through seasons when the landscape no longer behaved as expected. The earliest relationship between people and cattle in northern Africa remains debated. Wild aurochs lived across parts of the continent and were hunted long before herding became established. Some researchers have argued that cattle may have been domesticated independently in northeastern Africa, while others see the main domestic lineage arriving from Southwest Asia and then mixing with local animals. Genetic and archaeological evidence has narrowed parts of the argument without fully resolving it. What survives in the record suggests a complex history of movement, management, and interbreeding rather than one simple moment of domestication. Whatever their exact origin, managed cattle became increasingly important during the humid Holocene. Their bones appear at archaeological sites, their images spread across rock walls. Residues in pottery suggest the processing of animal products, including milk in some regions. Camps and seasonal routes began to reflect the needs of herds as well as those of people. Cattle were well suited to a landscape of broad grasslands and scattered water, but they were not desert animals in the later camel sense. They needed regular access to drinking water and adequate forage. During the wettest phases, those requirements could be met across wide areas. Seasonal rains renewed pasture. Lakes and rivers offered dependable watering points. Floodplains produced fresh growth after water receded. A herd could convert grass that humans could not digest into food that could be moved. This was one of pastoralism's great advantages. Instead of carrying every stored resource, people travelled with living animals that gathered energy from the landscape. Milk could provide nourishment without killing the animal. Blood may also have been used in some pastoral traditions, though direct evidence for specific early Saharan practices is limited. Dung fueled fires where wood was scarce and could be mixed into floors, plaster, or other materials. Yet a herd was not simply a portable storehouse. It could lose weight, become sick, fail to reproduce, or die if water disappeared. More animals meant greater wealth and greater vulnerability. Pastoral success depended on judging how much pressure a landscape could bear. Seasonal movement became increasingly organized around this balance. During or after the rains, herders could lead cattle into newly green areas. As surface pools dried, they returned toward permanent lakes, springs, river channels, or highland refuges. The route had to be timed carefully. Arriving too early might place animals on immature pasture. Arriving too late could mean finding a water source already crowded or exhausted. This movement was not random wandering. It required a mental map of enormous territory. Herders remembered the order in which pools dried, the quality of grass in different valleys, and the condition of routes between basins. They watched cloud formations, wind direction, plant growth, insect activity, and animal behavior. A distant storm might be more important than rain falling at the camp, because it could determine where pasture would exist weeks later. Cattle also changed the social landscape. Herds could be divided, exchanged, inherited, or transferred through marriage and alliance. They represented accumulated labor because raising an animal required years of attention. Their value was therefore practical and symbolic at the same time. Rock art reflects this importance. Cattle are drawn with different horn shapes, body markings, and decorative patterns. Some seem to wear pendants or other ornaments. People stand beside them, lead them, or gather around them. Certain images may represent prized animals, ritual scenes, ownership, or group identity. Scholars still debate the precise meaning, but the care devoted to individual animals suggests that cattle had become more than undifferentiated food. A surprising feature of some pastoral societies is that livestock can make people more mobile rather than less. Farming often ties communities to fields and harvest cycles. Herding encourages movement across broad grazing territories. In the Green Sahara, pastoralism allowed people to occupy regions where permanent crop cultivation would have been difficult, especially when rainfall was seasonal and uneven. This did not mean that all communities adopted the same way of life. Fishing remained important around lakes. Hunting continued. Wild plants were still gathered and processed. Some groups may have combined these activities with small herds, while others became more specialized pastoralists. The transition was not a sudden replacement of one economy by another. It was an expansion of choices. Those choices were shaped by climate. During stable wet decades, cattle could graze across extensive savanna. During drought, the same herds became difficult to sustain. Watering points drew people, livestock, and wild animals into tighter spaces. Grass near the shore was consumed first. Hooves broke the soil surface. Dung accumulated. Disease could spread more easily when animals concentrated together. The short droughts recorded during the African Humid Period would have tested pastoral strategies severely. A dry year could be managed through movement or stored knowledge. A decade of reduced rainfall was different. Herds might have to be split. Some animals could be slaughtered before they weakened. Routes might extend farther toward mountains, rivers, or southern grasslands. Communities with access to multiple water sources held an advantage over those dependent on one lake. The drought around 8,200 years before the present may have been especially disruptive because it coincided with a broader climatic event felt across much of the northern hemisphere. In the Sahara, its effects varied by region, but lake records indicate significant drying. People did not necessarily abandon the entire interior, yet the event revealed how quickly a water-rich system could become fragmented. Pastoralism may have offered resilience during such shifts. Animals could move when crops or local wild resources failed. Herds provided food during travel. Social networks allowed access to distant grazing or shared water. But pastoralism also increased exposure to environmental decline because livestock required reliable routes through the landscape. Human land use may have begun influencing vegetation locally. Grazing reduced plant cover around camps and water points. Repeated burning could encourage fresh grass or open travel routes. Trampling altered soil and drainage. Some researchers have proposed that pastoral activity helped accelerate the Sahara's later transition toward desert by weakening vegetation feedbacks. This remains controversial. The scale of orbital and monsoon change was enormous, and climate is widely understood as the primary driver of regional aridification. Human activity may have intensified drying in particular places or altered how vegetation responded. But it cannot by itself explain the continental transformation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the timing of environmental change across every basin. What can be seen more clearly is that herders adapted before the final drying. They shifted camp locations, changed herd composition, and relied on water sources with different seasonal patterns. In some regions, cattle may have been moved toward highlands during hot or dry periods. In others, lake shores became central gathering points. Takarkori preserves part of this pastoral world. The rock shelter lies in the Tadrata carcass of southwestern Libya, a mountain region where people lived, buried their dead, and managed livestock during the Green Sahara. Ancient DNA from 2 women buried there reveals a deeply rooted North African ancestry, while archaeological remains connect their community to pastoral practices. Their lives belonged to a population that had not simply crossed the Sahara. It had made a home within its changing valleys. The cattle they knew may have been central to food, movement, exchange, and identity. Their milk could be processed in ceramic vessels, their dung fed fires, their paths link pasture to water, their health reflected the condition of the landscape itself. By watching cattle, people could read the approach of scarcity. Animals tired sooner on dry routes. Grazing took longer. Calves struggled when mothers produced less milk. Watering places became crowded. Such signs appeared long before a lake vanished completely. This is how climate change often enters human life, not first as an abstract shift in rainfall averages, but as a series of practical difficulties. A familiar route no longer supports a herd. A pasture recovers more slowly. A spring becomes unreliable. One family moves earlier than usual and another follows. For generations, pastoral mobility allowed communities to live across the broad grasslands of the Green Sahara. Cattle carried survival through an uncertain world, but they also deepened human dependence on a network of water that was beginning to weaken. The animals that had helped people spread across the interior would soon guide them out of it, along narrowing corridors toward rivers, mountains, oases, and lands where the grass still returned. As herds and people moved along narrowing corridors, the Sahara revealed another role it had played during its wetter centuries. It was not only a homeland or a seasonal range, it was also a bridge. Landscapes that now seem separated by immense desert were once connected through chains of lakes, river valleys, grasslands, mountain refuges, and dependable springs. North Africa, the Nile Valley, the Sahel, the Mediterranean coast, and regions farther south became part of a broad zone through which people, animals, materials, and ideas could move. Modern maps encourage the eye to divide Africa at the Sahara. The north appears connected to the Mediterranean, while the lands to the south belong to a different geographic world. During the African Humid Period, that division weakened. The desert did not disappear completely, but its ecological barriers became more porous. Routes opened where water had once been too scarce for regular travel. A journey that would later require careful passage between isolated oases could instead follow rivers, wetlands, grazing grounds, and lake margins. Movement across such a landscape did not necessarily resemble a single migration from one side of the continent to the other. Most people probably travelled within familiar territories, extending routes gradually as conditions changed. One generation might reach a basin beyond the previous seasonal range. Another might form ties with communities farther north or east. Over centuries, repeated local movements could carry ancestry, technologies, languages, and customs across enormous distances without any traveller understanding the full continental pattern. The Nile Valley formed one of the most important corridors. Its river gathered water from far beyond the Sahara, flowing north through dry country toward the Mediterranean. During the humid period, the Nile did not stand alone as a narrow green strip between deserts, wetlands, seasonal tributaries, and habitable zones extended farther into surrounding regions. Connections between the Nile and the Eastern Sahara became easier, though they remained sensitive to fluctuating rainfall and extreme floods. Communities could move between riverine environments and interior basins, drawing on different resources at different times. The Nile offered fish, floodplains, and reliable direction. The Eastern Sahara offered seasonal pasture, hunting grounds, springs, and access to wider networks. When climate became unstable, people could retreat toward the river. When conditions improved, they could spread outward again. This repeated movement may have contributed to the concentration of populations along the Nile as the Sahara later dried, but it would be misleading to imagine the river simply waiting to receive refugees from an empty desert. The Nile Valley already contained its own communities, traditions, and environmental challenges. New arrivals entered inhabited landscapes, creating contact, exchange, competition, and cultural blending whose details remain difficult to reconstruct. To the west, the reactivated Tamaracet system and other drainage networks may have linked interior highlands to the Atlantic. Coastal regions, mountain zones, and inland basins could become connected through river routes during humid phases. People following these waterways encountered different stone sources, plant communities, animal populations, and neighbouring groups. Marine resources along the coast entered networks that extended inland, while materials from the interior moved outward. Across the central Sahara, mountain ranges served as stepping stones. The Hoggar, Tibesti, Tassili, and Caucasus regions offered water, shelter, and landmarks. Routes between them crossed open plains but could be organised around known basins and seasonal rainfall. Rock art traditions spread across some of these areas, yet local differences remained strong. Shared motifs may indicate contact, but they do not prove a single unified culture. The Green Sahara's connectivity is perhaps most visible in the distribution of technologies. Pottery appeared early among African hunter-gatherers and spread through broad regions in varied forms. Harpoon traditions linked fishing communities around lakes and rivers. Grinding equipment reflected intensified plant processing. Later, pastoral practices and domesticated cattle moved across northern Africa. None of these developments followed one simple path, and similar tools could arise independently, but their wide distribution suggests sustained interaction. Stone itself travelled. Obsidian and other distinctive materials can sometimes be traced to geological sources far from where artifacts are found. A tool made from distant stone may have moved through direct travel, exchange between neighbouring groups, or a long chain of transfers. Its presence shows that social space extended beyond the horizon of a single camp. Human biology records these connections at an even deeper level. The ancient genomes from Takarkori reveal a population with a long-established North African ancestry and limited but significant genetic input from south of the Sahara. This pattern suggests contact across ecological zones without complete population replacement. The Green Sahara allowed people to meet, yet geographic, social, and cultural boundaries still preserved distinct lineages. The result complicates any simple idea of the Sahara as either barrier or highway. It could be both. During wetter phases, rivers and grasslands encouraged movement. During drought, the same route could close. Mountain ranges offered refuge but also separated communities. Large lakes attracted people while creating obstacles that had to be crossed or circled. A region connected in one century might fragment in the next. The 9, 308, 200-year droughts likely interrupted these networks. Falling lake levels broke aquatic links. Pasture disappeared along exposed routes. Communities gathered near surviving water, perhaps increasing contact in some refuges while isolating people elsewhere. When rainfall recovered, old paths could reopen, but social geography may already have changed. Such climatic pulses help explain why genetic and cultural patterns do not show endless mixing across the Sahara. Connectivity came in waves. Populations expanded, met, withdrew, and sometimes remained separated long enough to develop distinctive traditions. The Sahara behaved like a gate opening and closing according to rainfall. Animals also moved through these corridors. Species ranges expanded northward during humid phases, and aquatic animals reached interior basins through connected waterways. Domestic livestock travelled with herders. Plant species followed rainfall and river valleys, while seeds were also carried by people and animals. The biological map of Africa shifted alongside the human one. The Mediterranean coast formed the northern edge of this changing system. Communities there had access to marine environments, coastal plains, and connections east and west. As interior routes opened, contact between the coast and the central Sahara became more feasible. This did not mean uninterrupted travel from the Sahel to the Mediterranean, but it created overlapping networks through which influences could spread. Some popular accounts go too far, treating the Green Sahara as the single explanation for every later civilization in northern Africa. The evidence does not support such a direct line. The people of the humid Sahara lived thousands of years before many historic states emerged, and cultural development involved local innovation, migration, environmental change, and interaction over long periods. Their legacy is real, but it is not a hidden blueprint for all that followed. What they helped create was a connected human landscape. Knowledge of cattle, pottery, fishing, seasonal movement, and dryland survival travelled through communities that occupied the interior. When the climate shifted, these traditions did not disappear with the lakes. People carried them toward the Nile, the Sahel, North African highlands, and remaining oases. The Green Sahara therefore belongs to the history of many regions at once. It links places later separated by desert and by modern categories. Its inhabitants were neither simply northern nor southern, coastal nor inland. They lived within a moving ecological world whose boundaries expanded and contracted around them. For several millennia, water allowed these connections to endure. A traveller could follow grass, rivers, herds, and remembered springs across country that would later become nearly impassable. But the routes depended on a climate system already showing signs of instability. The gate across Africa was still open, though each drought narrowed it. Soon, the question would no longer be how far people could travel through the green interior, but how quickly they could recognize that the paths behind them were closing. The first signs of decline would not have looked like the end of a world. A lake might stand slightly lower than usual after the dry season. Grass might return late on a familiar plain. A spring that once flowed steadily could weaken for several weeks before recovering. None of these changes, taken alone, would prove that the climate had shifted. The people of the Green Sahara already knew variation. They had lived through difficult years, sudden floods, failed rains, and short droughts. What changed was the frequency with which uncertainty returned. The monsoon had always been seasonal, and its northern reach had never been fixed. As northern hemisphere summer sunlight gradually weakened through the middle and later Holocene, the contrast between the hot African landmass and the surrounding ocean also diminished. Moist air was drawn less forcefully into the continent. The rain belt did not collapse in a single season, but its average position began to retreat southward. This orbital shift was extremely slow. No person could watch the geometry of Earth's motion change. Human communities experienced its consequences indirectly through the behavior of water and vegetation. Rain still came, but it became less dependable in some regions. Storms could remain intense while growing farther apart. A basin might receive enough water to fill 1 year and then endure several seasons of decline. The Green Sahara did not begin drying everywhere at once. Northern margins became vulnerable earlier in some reconstructions. Certain western and central regions retained lakes and grasslands longer. Mountains preserved localized moisture after surrounding plains had deteriorated. Groundwater-fed springs could continue flowing even when surface rainfall weakened, creating the appearance of stability in one valley while a nearby basin was already failing. This uneven retreat complicated every decision. People could not simply move south at the first sign of dryness, because better conditions might still exist to the north, east, or at higher elevation. A family leaving a shrinking lake might find another basin recovering after recent storms. Herders followed rumors, tracks, cloud formations, and information carried by travelers. Movement became increasingly exploratory. The lakes revealed the shift slowly and then suddenly. A deep basin could absorb years of reduced rainfall before the shoreline changed dramatically. Shallow wetlands responded much faster. As inflow weakened, water withdrew from broad margins and exposed mudflats. Channels that had connected pools broke into isolated reaches. Fish became concentrated in shrinking water, briefly making them easier to catch before oxygen declined and habitats collapsed. Receding shores could seem productive at first. Fresh mud supported plants, fish and shellfish gathered in smaller areas, animals concentrated near remaining water, creating opportunities for hunters. Yet these benefits were temporary. If rainfall did not recover, the exposed ground dried and cracked. Salts accumulated. Reeds retreated. The lake's ecological diversity narrowed until only the most tolerant species remained. Pastoralists saw the same process in the grasslands. Early rains might produce a green flush too weak to sustain a large herd. Pasture around permanent water was grazed repeatedly because more distant routes had become unreliable. Cattle travelled farther between feeding and drinking. Their condition reflected the landscape before any formal measure could have done so. Less milk, slower recovery, and weaker calves were climate signals written in living bodies. The warning signs described in paleoclimate records suggest that the system did not move smoothly from wet to dry. Before the African Humid Period ended, some regions experienced repeated droughts lasting roughly 2 to 8 decades. These dry intervals were long enough to shape social memory. A person born during one might reach adulthood without seeing the lakes return to their former level. This pattern resembles a climate system losing resilience. After a disturbance, a stable wet landscape should recover relatively quickly. Vegetation grows back, soil moisture returns, and lakes refill. As the monsoon weakens, recovery becomes slower and less complete. Each drought leaves a deeper mark. Grass cover thins, dust increases, water bodies shrink farther. The next dry episode begins from a more fragile starting point. The feedbacks that had helped create the Green Sahara now began working in reverse. Less rain meant less vegetation. Bare ground reflected more sunlight and released less moisture through plants. Dust rose more easily from exposed surfaces. These changes could weaken the regional conditions that favoured rainfall, reinforcing the retreat of the monsoon. Scientists describe such behavior with terms like tipping points and critical transitions, but people living through it would have known it as the failure of familiar patterns. A valley that once recovered after drought no longer did. A shoreline returned only halfway. A pasture used every third year needed twice as long to recover. A migration route gained one more dry crossing. Not every change would have been recognized immediately as permanent. Human memory is powerful but limited. A community might preserve stories of greater lakes or richer grasslands, yet each generation also accepts the conditions of its own childhood as normal. Decline can become visible only when several generations compare what they remember. The Sahara's art may preserve part of this shift. Cattle remain central, but later traditions increasingly reflect changing mobility and new ways of crossing open country. The imagery does not provide a direct annual record of rainfall, yet its long sequence follows a landscape in transition. Animals dependent on deep water and extensive grasslands become less prominent. Eventually, creatures suited to aridity enter the visual record. Archaeological sites also begin to change. Some lakeside camps are abandoned, occupation concentrates near more dependable water. Settlement histories become discontinuous as people return during brief improvements and leave again when conditions worsen. The absence of artifacts cannot always prove abandonment, but broad patterns show populations withdrawing from increasingly dry regions. The Nile became more important as interior water systems failed. Its floods remained variable and sometimes extreme, yet the river offered a continuity that many Saharan basins could no longer provide. Farther south, the Sahel retained seasonal grasslands as the desert boundary advanced. Mountain valleys and oases became refuges whose value increased with every lost route. Competition may have intensified around these dependable places, though the evidence is often too limited to reconstruct specific conflicts. It is safer to say that pressure increased. More people and livestock depended on fewer reliable water sources. Social agreements over access became more important. Exchange networks could provide support, but they also carried news of failure from distant regions. Some communities adapted by reducing herd size. Others changed the mix of animals they managed. Sheep and goats, better suited than cattle to certain dry conditions, became increasingly important in some areas. Fishing communities moved with shrinking lakes or relied more heavily on terrestrial resources. Hunting patterns changed as wild animals withdrew southward or concentrated around refuges. Human land use may have amplified local degradation. Repeated grazing near water reduced plant cover, trampling damaged soils, burning altered vegetation. Yet the larger drying trend cannot be explained by human activity alone. Orbital change and monsoon weakening remain the central forces. The human contribution, where it mattered, likely intensified stress in landscapes already becoming vulnerable. By around 6,000 years before the present, the green system was under growing pressure across much of northern Africa. Around 5,500 years ago, many records indicate a major transition toward the hyper-arid conditions that would define the later Sahara. But even this was not a single moment. Some lakes survived longer, some mountain regions remained habitable, some river corridors faded centuries before others. The end approached as a patchwork, just as the green world had begun. One basin dried while another still held fish. One community moved while another remained. One route closed, forcing travel through a more distant valley. The transformation was continental in scale but local in experience. That is what made it so difficult to recognize. There was no final storm, no single year when every river stopped. The monsoon weakened through repeated disappointments. Water returned, but not as fully. Grass grew, but not as widely. Lakes endured, but their shorelines pulled inward. The green world was not gone yet. Its rivers still flowed in places, cattle still crossed open pasture, and people still buried their dead in landscapes they considered home. But the climate had begun to forget the pattern that sustained them. The Sahara was entering a long threshold between abundance and desert, and every drought now carried the possibility that the water might not come back. The disappearance of the Green Sahara has often been told as though an entire landscape collapsed almost overnight. In some versions, grasslands wither, lakes vanish, and communities flee within a few generations. In others, the desert advances so slowly that no one living through it would have recognized a decisive ending. The evidence now suggests that both images contain part of the truth, because the Sahara did not dry in one way, at one speed, or at one time. Some records point to abrupt change. Lake sediments can shift rapidly from layers formed in fresh water to deposits associated with shallow, salty, or wind-blown conditions. Pollen from grasses and wetland plants may decline sharply, while desert species and dust increase. In certain basins, shorelines retreat over relatively short intervals. Such transitions suggest that a landscape capable of absorbing smaller fluctuations eventually crossed a threshold and reorganized into a much drier state. Other records show a longer decline. Vegetation thins over centuries. Lakes shrink in stages. Human occupation becomes intermittent before disappearing. Mountain refuges remain inhabited after surrounding plains are abandoned. A lake may survive as a shallow body long after its wetlands and connecting rivers are lost. From this perspective, the end of the Green Sahara is not a collapse but a prolonged unravelling. The difference is partly a matter of scale. A transition lasting 2 centuries is abrupt in a geological record but spans many human generations. A drought lasting 30 years may look brief in a sediment core, yet it can dominate the memory of a community. What seems sudden to a lake may feel gradual to a continent, and what seems gradual to climate science may feel catastrophic to people who lose the only reliable water source they know. The evidence from Lake Yoa makes this especially clear. Annual sediment layers reveal short, severe droughts interrupting the humid period before its final termination. Around 9,300 and 8,200 years before the present, and perhaps again near 6,300 years ago, water and vegetation were disrupted on decadal timescales. These events did not permanently end the Green Sahara, but they demonstrated how quickly local conditions could deteriorate. A community living near a lake during one of these droughts might first notice a delayed rainy season. Then the shoreline would retreat beyond familiar fishing grounds. Reeds would thin, grazing would worsen, and travel to water would lengthen. If the drought continued, people might move temporarily, expecting to return. Some would, others might establish new routes and never come back. When rainfall resumed, the lake could recover, but perhaps not completely. This repeated instability may have trained communities to remain mobile, while also weakening confidence in places once treated as permanent homes. A drought that ends after 20 years still changes burial grounds, migration routes, alliances, and the distribution of herds. The better-known climate event around 8,200 years ago appears in records across the Northern Hemisphere and was likely linked to the release of meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean and atmospheric circulation. Its effects varied widely. In parts of the Sahara, it intensified drying already possible within the monsoon system. Some lakes fell, while other regions responded less dramatically. The event was not the single cause of Saharan desertification, but it exposed the vulnerability of a landscape dependent on rainfall reaching far north. The final transition after roughly 6,000 years before the present was more persistent. As orbital conditions continued to reduce summer heating, monsoon rains retreated southward, vegetation feedbacks weakened, dust increased. Lakes recovered less fully after drought, around 5,500 years ago. Many records show a major shift toward the arid regime that would define much of the later Sahara. Yet even this date must be treated as a broad marker rather than a universal deadline. In western regions, some humid conditions may have ended earlier. In mountain basins, water persisted longer. Groundwater sustained springs after rainfall declined. The Nile and parts of the Sahel remained productive while central basins became increasingly dry. The Sahara was not switched off, it fragmented. That fragmentation shaped human experience more than any continental average. A herding group did not need the whole Sahara to remain green. It needed enough pasture between known water sources. Once one link in the route failed, an entire seasonal circuit could become unusable. A distance once crossed in 2 days might require 4. A lake that remained technically present can become too salty for livestock. A valley that still received rain might no longer produce enough grass. This is why small environmental changes could have large social consequences. The loss of one spring forced several groups toward another. Crowding increased pressure on grazing. Herds arrived earlier and stayed longer. Agreements over access became more important. While the risk of disease and local depletion rose, a landscape did not have to become true desert before it became difficult to inhabit. Different livelihoods experienced the decline differently. Fishing communities were highly sensitive to lake contraction and the breaking of river connections. Pastoralists could move farther, but their herds required water and forage across the route. Hunters followed animals withdrawing toward better watered regions. Plant gatherers lost species as wetlands and grasslands contracted. No single strategy remained secure everywhere. The archaeological record captures these adjustments unevenly. Camps move toward deeper basins. Some settlements become shorter-lived. Pottery styles and livestock remains appear in new regions. Burial grounds are abandoned. Yet it is difficult to separate climatic migration from social choice, changing technology, or contact with neighboring groups. Scholars still debate how directly particular population movements can be tied to specific droughts. Climate models also produce different pictures of the ending. Some show a relatively smooth southward retreat of vegetation. Others allow rapid regional transitions once rainfall falls below critical levels. Models that include vegetation and dust feedbacks often generate sharper changes than those driven by orbital forcing alone. The uncertainty does not mean the models are useless. It shows that the Sahara's response depended on interactions among atmosphere, soil, plants, lakes, and human land use. One debated possibility is that grazing and burning made some regions more vulnerable to collapse. Livestock concentrated around water could reduce plant cover, while fire might alter the balance between grasses and shrubs. If vegetation weakened, more dust could rise and less moisture could return to the atmosphere. In theory, these local effects could amplify a drying climate. The scale of this influence remains uncertain. Human populations were unevenly distributed, and vast areas were lightly occupied. Climate change was clearly capable of driving aridification without human help. It is therefore more accurate to see land use as a possible regional accelerator rather than the master cause. No single explanation fully accounts for the varied timing of decline. The idea of a sudden paradise lost is also misleading because the humid Sahara was never paradise. It contained drought, dangerous animals, flood extremes, disease, and difficult travel. Its inhabitants were already adapted to uncertainty. What ended was not a flawless world, but a broad network of possibilities: connected lakes, seasonal rivers, wide grazing corridors, and routes linking distant regions. The loss of that network could happen quickly once enough links failed. A river no longer reached a basin no longer overflowed into the next. Fish populations became isolated. Herds could not cross between pastures. Human communities that had exchanged goods and partners became separated by expanding dry ground. This is where the gradual and abrupt interpretations meet. Orbital change weakened the monsoon over millennia. Vegetation and lakes responded over centuries. Individual droughts struck over decades. A particular route could fail in a single season. The ending operated at all of these speeds at once. For those living through it, there may never have been one clear moment when the Green Sahara ended. There were only repeated departures, delayed returns, and places spoken of in the past tense. A lake became a marsh, then a salt flat. A river became a chain of pools, then a dry channel. Grassland became scrub, and scrub opened into gravel and sand. Eventually, the intervals of recovery became too brief to restore the old world. The green landscape survived in fragments, then in refuges, then in memory. Its disappearance was not one catastrophe, but a sequence of thresholds crossed at different times, until the continent-scale network of water had broken beyond repair. By the time the Green Sahara began breaking into isolated refuges, human communities had already altered parts of the landscape around them. Herds grazed near lakes and springs. Fires cleared vegetation, renewed grass, or prepared camps. Repeated travel compacted soil along familiar routes. Settlements concentrated fuel use, waste, and animal traffic within narrow zones. The question is not whether people changed their surroundings. They did. The harder question is whether those changes helped push an already drying Sahara toward desert. This debate sits at the boundary between climate science and archaeology, where evidence is often suggestive but incomplete. The broad cause of the Sahara's transformation is well established. Changes in Earth's orbit gradually weakened northern hemisphere summer heating. The African monsoon lost strength and retreated southward. Rainfall declined, lakes contracted, and vegetation thinned. These forces operated across a region too vast to be explained primarily by human activity. Yet large climate systems can be sensitive to local feedbacks. Vegetation does more than respond to rainfall. It influences the surface temperature, the amount of sunlight reflected from the ground, the movement of moisture back into the atmosphere, and the quantity of dust exposed to wind. If plants disappear from a vulnerable region, that loss can reinforce drying. Human land use may therefore have mattered not as the original cause, but as one additional pressure on a system already approaching a threshold. Pastoralism created the most obvious form of pressure. Cattle require large amounts of forage and regular water. During wetter centuries, grasslands could recover from grazing across wide areas. As rainfall declined, however, pasture became patchier, and herds concentrated near the most dependable lakes, springs, and river channels. The same ground was used more frequently. Plants were eaten before producing seed. Hooves broke protective soil crusts and exposed loose sediment. The effect would have been strongest around water. A lake might remain full enough to support people and animals while its surrounding pasture deteriorated. Herds approached along repeated paths, creating bare corridors. Camps clustered on raised ground near the shoreline. Dung accumulated. Fuel was gathered, and shrubs were cut for shelter or firewood. Seen from a distance, the region still appeared inhabited and productive. At ground level, the pressure on vegetation could be intense. When a drought arrived, damaged pasture recovered more slowly. Wind lifted dust from exposed soil. Rain falling on compacted ground ran off instead of soaking in, sometimes cutting channels and carrying fertile sediment away. These processes are familiar in modern drylands, but applying them to the ancient Sahara requires caution. Herd sizes, population densities, grazing duration, and vegetation resilience are difficult to estimate. Animal bones reveal which species people managed, but not the exact number of animals alive at one time. A site rich in cattle remains may represent a large herd used briefly, or smaller herds returning over centuries. Rock art emphasizes cattle, yet artistic importance does not directly measure population size. Archaeological sites are concentrated around known water sources, which can make human activity appear denser than it was across the wider landscape. Fire presents another uncertainty. People may have burned grass to encourage fresh growth, improve visibility, guide animals, reduce pests, or clear space around camps. Natural fires also occurred after lightning, especially when seasonal vegetation dried. Charcoal preserved in sediments confirms that burning took place, but identifying the person, storm, or purpose behind a particular fire is rarely possible. Used carefully, fire can maintain grassland and prevent shrubs from becoming dominant. Used repeatedly under drying conditions, it can reduce plant cover and damage regeneration. Its effect depends on timing, frequency, rainfall, and plant type. A single explanation cannot describe every region of the Sahara. Some researchers have proposed that the spread of pastoralism coincided with changes in vegetation, suggesting that grazing and burning accelerated desertification. In this view, people weakened the ecological feedbacks that helped carry monsoon rain northward. Less vegetation meant a brighter, drier surface. Dust increased. Atmospheric circulation changed, and the wet landscape became less able to recover. The hypothesis is plausible at local or regional scales, but proving it across the entire Sahara is difficult. The decline of rainfall was already underway because of orbital change. Some areas dried where archaeological evidence for intensive pastoralism is sparse. Other heavily used regions remained habitable for centuries. Climate records also show that humid periods ended before widespread livestock management existed, demonstrating that the Sahara can return to desert without human assistance. The strongest interpretation therefore lies between two extremes. People did not create the Sahara, and they were not irrelevant to its transformation. Human activity may have amplified environmental stress in particular basins, especially during prolonged drought. It may have changed the sequence in which plants disappeared, the amount of dust produced locally, or the speed with which a heavily used shoreline became unusable. Such local changes could carry large consequences for communities. A pasture damaged by overuse might force herders toward another lake. Their arrival increased grazing pressure there. Several groups displaced by drought could converge on the same refuge, not because the entire region was empty, but because the remaining dependable places had become fewer. Environmental pressure moved through social networks as well as ecosystems. Communities were capable of restraint and adjustment. They could split herds, rotate grazing grounds, move seasonally, protect certain water sources, or change the balance between cattle, sheep, and goats. Dryland pastoralism depends on flexibility. and the people of the Green Sahara had generations of experience reading unstable conditions. Their survival demonstrates skill, not careless destruction. But knowledge has limits when the climate itself is shifting. A grazing route that had recovered reliably for centuries might begin failing despite careful use. A spring protected from overuse could still decline as groundwater recharge weakened. A community might follow every inherited rule and still encounter a landscape changing beyond the range of ancestral experience. This distinction matters because environmental collapse is often reduced to a moral story. People are portrayed either as helpless victims of climate or as destroyers of a natural paradise. The evidence supports neither simplification. Saharan communities depended on animals and plants, modified them, and responded to consequences. They made choices within conditions they did not control. Human presence may even have increased diversity in some settings. Grazing can prevent dense shrubs from replacing open grassland. Burning can produce mosaics of vegetation at different stages of growth. Dung adds nutrients. Water management and repeated movement can create localized habitats. The same activity that degrades one area under drought may sustain another under wetter conditions. The timing of change was therefore crucial. During the height of the humid period, ecosystems could absorb disturbance, rain restored pasture, lakes refilled, and plants recolonized bare ground. As resilience declined, identical behavior produced different results. A herd size that had once been sustainable became too large. A fire that once renewed grass left soil exposed. A familiar camp used for generations became a center of erosion. The early warning signals preserved in climate records describe this loss of resilience. Dry episodes became more damaging, and recovery slowed. Human pressure did not need to be enormous to matter within such a weakened system. It only needed to occur in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still, the continental story remains driven by the sky. The monsoon withdrew because the seasonal distribution of solar energy changed. Vegetation feedbacks, dust, lakes, oceans, and land use influenced the details, but none replaced the astronomical rhythm beneath the transition. The Sahara had shifted between humid and arid states before large herds moved across it, and it would continue to respond to orbital cycles long after ancient pastoral societies disappeared. What people changed most clearly was not the direction of the climate, but the human consequences of its decline. Through livestock, social networks, mobility, and accumulated knowledge, they could remain in drying regions longer than many hunting communities might have done. They carried food across barren stretches and used animals to convert sparse grass into nourishment. Pastoralism increased pressure, but it also delayed abandonment. That delay may have made the final departure more difficult. Generations had invested memory, burial grounds, roots, and identity in particular valleys. Cattle had become central to wealth and ritual. Leaving did not mean simply following better weather. It meant abandoning places where ancestors rested and where every spring ridge and painted wall carried meaning. As the last broad corridors of pasture failed, people and herds began moving toward landscapes that could still support them. Some turned south with the retreating rain. Others followed mountains, groundwater, or the dependable course of the Nile. Human activity may have marked the places they left, but climate determined why those places could no longer recover. The Green Sahara ended through an interaction between a weakening natural system and communities doing everything they could to remain within it. Leaving the Green Sahara did not happen as one great migration moving in a single direction. It happened through countless smaller decisions. A camp abandoned one season earlier than usual. A herd led toward a more distant spring. a burial place visited for the last time, a family choosing not to return when the rains failed again. Some communities moved south with the retreating grasslands. Others gathered around the Nile, climbed into mountain refuges, or remained near groundwater-fed oases. The desert did not empty in one moment. It released its people unevenly, basin by basin. For generations, mobility had been part of Saharan life. People followed fish, pasture, rain, wild plants, and livestock. They knew how to leave a place without necessarily abandoning it. Seasonal departure assumed return. The later drying changed that expectation. Routes that once formed circles began becoming one-way paths. A community might move away from a shrinking lake during drought, intending to return after several wet seasons. When the rain finally came, the lake could still remain too shallow, salty, or surrounded by poor pasture. A second generation might visit less often. By the third, the old shoreline survived mainly in memory. The first departures may have been short. People shifted from exposed plains toward deep basins, volcanic highlands, and valleys where groundwater remained accessible. Mountain regions such as the Tibesti, Hoggar, Tassili, and Akakas offered shelter and localized water after much of the surrounding country became difficult. Rain captured at elevation fed springs and temporary streams. Rock shelters provided continuity in landscapes increasingly divided by dry ground. These refuges could sustain life, but they also concentrated it. More people and livestock depended on fewer places. Pasture near springs was consumed quickly. Fuel became harder to gather. Water access required negotiation. Social networks that had once connected distant communities became essential for survival. The archaeological record sometimes shows repeated occupation of such shelters long after neighbouring plains had been abandoned. Pottery, animal bones, hearths, and burials indicate that communities returned to favoured valleys even as their wider ranges contracted. Yet persistence did not mean isolation from change. Every surviving refuge existed within a shrinking network. To the south, the Sahel offered a broad zone where seasonal rainfall still renewed grasslands. As the monsoon withdrew, ecological boundaries moved with it. People and animals followed these shifting conditions, carrying pastoral traditions into regions better suited to livestock. The southward movement was not necessarily a flight into unknown territory. Contacts had existed throughout the humid period, and some routes were already familiar through exchange, seasonal travel, and kinship. The arrival of new herding groups did not occur in empty lands. Communities already lived across the Sahel, using local rivers, grasslands, plants, and animals. Migration therefore produced interaction rather than simple replacement. Techniques, livestock, pottery styles, and social practices mixed with established traditions. In some areas, new identities may have formed from this contact. In others, cultural boundaries persisted. The exact scale of movement remains debated. Archaeological evidence is incomplete, and similar material traditions do not always prove that people migrated. Ideas and objects can travel without large population shifts, yet ancient DNA, settlement patterns, and livestock histories all suggest that the drying Sahara contributed to a major redistribution of people across northern Africa. The Nile Valley became one of the most important destinations. Unlike interior lakes dependent entirely on local rainfall and runoff, the Nile drew water from distant catchments. Its floods varied and could be extreme, but the river endured as surrounding regions became arid. This reliability made the valley increasingly attractive. People moving toward the Nile encountered a landscape already inhabited and socially complex. They brought knowledge shaped by lakes, herding, fishing, pottery, and long-distance mobility. The communities along the river possessed their own traditions, technologies, and relationships with seasonal floods. The interaction between them unfolded over centuries. It is tempting to connect the Green Sahara directly to the later rise of ancient Egypt, as though desert refugees simply gathered beside the Nile and built civilization. The real history is slower and more complicated. Millennia separated the height of Saharan humidity from the emergence of the Egyptian state. Population concentration, local development, agriculture, trade, political competition, and river ecology all contributed. The drying Sahara may have helped redirect people and knowledge toward the Nile, but it was not a single cause of pharaonic civilization. Still, the environmental pressure was profound. The Nile became a narrowing corridor through increasingly dry country. Settlements grew more closely tied to predictable water and floodplain resources. Human life that had once spread across broad Saharan landscapes became concentrated along a river whose banks could be measured, defended, cultivated, and organized in ways open grasslands could not. Farther west, people moved toward the Atlas Mountains, Atlantic margins, remaining wetlands, and oases fed by groundwater. Some groups adapted to coastal resources. Others maintained pastoral mobility between mountains and lowlands. In the central desert, isolated water sources became permanent anchors rather than seasonal stops. Oases were not remnants of the Green Sahara in any simple sense. Many depended on aquifers recharged during earlier humid periods, storing ancient water beneath the ground. Wells and springs allowed life to continue where surface rainfall had nearly vanished. In later centuries, these places would support trade routes across the desert, but their deeper history began as refuges around water left behind by a wetter age. The human geography of Africa was being redrawn. Routes that had crossed open savanna became hazardous passages between isolated water sources. Former lake basins turned into salt flats. Rivers became dry valleys remembered only through their shape. Mountain shelters looked out over plains no longer capable of supporting the herds shown on their walls. The animals moved too. Giraffes, elephants, hippos, and many antelope species withdrew toward regions where water and vegetation remained sufficient. Crocodile populations became isolated in shrinking aquatic refuges. Fish disappeared from basins cut off from rivers. Domestic herds survived because people guided them, but herd composition changed as aridity favored animals better adapted to sparse forage and longer dry intervals. Sheep and goats became increasingly useful in some regions because they could exploit rougher vegetation and manage with less water than cattle under certain conditions. Much later, the camel would transform desert travel, but it did not belong to the main Green Sahara pastoral world. The earliest refugees from the drying interior moved without the animal that would eventually become the symbol of the Sahara. They carried what could survive movement livestock, stone tools, pottery traditions, memories of roots, knowledge of water, and stories attached to places left behind. Heavy grinding stones or large vessels might be abandoned. Rock art remained on the walls. Burial grounds stayed where they had been made. The material record of departure is therefore partly a record of what people could not take with them. There was no reason for every community to understand the drying in the same way. Some may have treated drought as a temporary failure. Others recognized a pattern through oral memory. Elders could compare shorelines with those of earlier decades. Herders knew which pastures no longer recovered. Fishers saw species disappear from shrinking lakes. Movement also transformed identity. A group once associated with a particular basin might become defined by its herd, migration route, or refuge. New alliances formed around access to water. Traditions were preserved, altered, or abandoned as communities entered different ecological worlds. The people leaving the Sahara were not simply climate victims. They are active migrants carrying skills developed through thousands of years of environmental change. Their ability to move livestock, exploit seasonal resources, and maintain social networks made survival possible. Yet adaptation always required loss. A route closed. A painted shelter was left beyond the safe range of travel. A lake known through generations became a pale depression on the horizon. The green world did not vanish from memory when its water disappeared. It travelled with the people who had lived within it, entering the cultures of river valleys, grasslands, mountains, and oases. By the time the Sahara approached its later arid form, its former inhabitants had become part of many other landscapes. Their descendants lived beside the Nile, across the Sahel, within North African highlands, and around desert springs. The broad homeland that once connected them had broken apart, but the knowledge formed there continued to move through Africa. What the desert lost in water, the surrounding regions gained in people, animals, practices, and memory. The Green Sahara had ceased to function as a connected human world, yet its disappearance did not erase those who had lived there. It scattered them, carrying the legacy of vanished rivers far beyond the dunes that replaced them. The Sahara's buried legacy survives in forms that do not resemble a lost civilization in the usual sense. There are no ruined capitals rising from the dunes, no single vanished empire, no monument large enough to summarize thousands of years of changing water and human movement. What remains is more dispersed and, in some ways, more difficult to comprehend abandoned shorelines, ancient genomes, dry river channels, rock paintings, fish bones, groundwater, pastoral traditions, and human populations whose histories were shaped by a landscape that no longer exists. The clearest legacy lies beneath the surface. Radar images continue to reveal paleo-channels hidden under sand, some preserving the roots of rivers that once connected highlands, basins, and coastlines. These channels are not merely evidence of former rainfall. They are maps of old ecological corridors. Along them moved water, sediment, plants, animals, and people. Their buried courses help explain why archaeological sites appear where modern geography would never predict them. The Taman Reset system remains one of the most dramatic examples. Its vanished tributaries extend across Western Sahara toward the Atlantic, while marine sediments preserve material transported from the continental interior. The river demonstrates that the modern desert surface conceals a drainage network of enormous scale. Yet its exact history is still being refined. It may have flowed strongly during several humid episodes rather than continuously, and different branches probably responded differently to rainfall. The evidence remains incomplete, but the system is real enough to overturn the assumption that the Sahara has always divided Western Africa from its coast. Elsewhere, fossil shorelines reveal the former extent of lakes such as Mega Chad. Their contours can be followed across plains that now support villages, dry grassland, salt deposits, and open desert. These ancient beaches show that water once reorganized the region on a scale far beyond the modern lake. People lived near those shores, moved with them, and left artifacts along margins now separated from water by great distances. Some of the Green Sahara remains physically present as groundwater. During humid millennia, rain and rivers recharged large aquifers beneath northern Africa. In places, modern wells draw from water that entered the ground thousands of years ago. This fossil water is a hidden inheritance from the humid period, but it is not easily renewed under present conditions. Once removed, it may take far longer than human history to replace. The desert therefore contains ancient water as both memory and resource. A modern settlement may depend on an aquifer filled when hippos lived in nearby lakes and cattle grazed across land now barren. The connection is invisible at the surface, yet it links present survival to a climate state that ended millennia ago. The human legacy is equally hidden. Ancient DNA from Takarkori has revealed a deeply rooted North African ancestry, preserved in people who lived within the Green Sahara around 7,000 years ago. Their genomes show that the region supported long-established communities, not simply temporary migrants moving between north and south. They also carry evidence of contact across the continent, though less mixing than might be expected from a completely open corridor. This finding complicates older models of African population history. The Sahara was sometimes a barrier, sometimes a bridge, and often both at once. During humid periods, movement became easier, but cultural and geographic boundaries still mattered. Populations could exchange genes and practices while remaining distinct. When aridity returned, those connections narrowed, leaving patterns that survive indirectly in later populations. No modern community can be reduced to a single Green Sahara ancestry, and the genetic history of northern Africa includes many later migrations and interactions. Yet the ancient genomes demonstrate that lineages once lived in the desert interior, whose story had been almost entirely invisible. More discoveries may reveal additional populations, but preservation conditions are harsh, and human remains suitable for DNA analysis are rare. Archaeology preserves a broader inheritance: pottery traditions, fishing technologies, grinding practices, pastoral knowledge, and patterns of mobility spread beyond the drying Sahara. Communities carried them toward the Nile, the Sahel, the Maghreb, highland refuges, and remaining oases. These practices changed as they entered new environments, becoming part of a later local histories rather than surviving unchanged. Cattle pastoralism is among the strongest examples. Knowledge developed across the humid grasslands helped shape mobile herding traditions suited to uncertain rainfall. The ability to move animals between seasonal pastures, manage water access, and maintain networks across long distances remained valuable after the broad green corridors disappeared. Pastoralism did not originate from one community or one event, but the Green Sahara was one of the great landscapes in which it expanded and diversified. Rock art preserves the most visible human memory, though its meaning remains partly sealed. Elephants, giraffes, cattle, swimmers, hunters, and ceremonial figures continue to inhabit stone surfaces while the living world around them has changed beyond recognition. The images are sometimes treated as illustrations of climate history, but they are more than environmental evidence. They record how people understood themselves within that environment. A painted animal may represent food, danger, prestige, myth, ancestry, or sacred power. A cattle scene may reflect wealth, identity, or ritual rather than an ordinary herding day. The artist did not create the panels for future scientists. Modern viewers can identify the species and techniques, but the deeper language of the images is largely lost. That loss is itself part of the Green Sahara's legacy. Entire systems of meaning disappeared without written records. Languages changed or vanished. Place names were forgotten. Routes known through generations became unusable. Stories tied to lakes and mountains may have survived in altered forms among descendant communities, but tracing them directly across thousands of years is rarely possible. Popular theories sometimes try to fill this silence with unsupported claims of forgotten advanced kingdoms, drowned cities, or a single mysterious culture responsible for all Saharan art and monuments. Such ideas are not required to make the past remarkable. The verified history is already extraordinary. Mobile fishing, hunting, and pastoral communities lived across an immense unstable landscape, adapted to climatic shifts, formed long-distance networks, and left evidence that continues to transform scientific understanding. The real mystery is not the absence of a hidden empire. It is how much human history can disappear when the environment that supported it collapses. A lake-centered community leaves few recognizable traces once the lakebed becomes desert. A route across grassland becomes meaningless when water sources vanish. Organic shelters decay. Wind scatters surface artifacts. Dunes bury camps beneath meters of sand. Future discoveries may come from places currently considered empty. Satellite surveys can locate channels and former shorelines. Machine learning reconstructions can identify zones where vegetation and water likely persisted. Archaeologists can use those maps to search for camps, burials, and rock shelters hidden beyond known sites. Ancient DNA may reveal additional lineages, while sediment records refine the chronology of rainfall and drought. The newer evidence already shows that the humid period was more unstable than once believed. Decadal droughts repeatedly interrupted the green world. Extreme rainfall filled mountain lakes and drove floods. Vegetation shifted region by region rather than advancing as one uniform front. The end arrived through both long decline and sudden local thresholds. This complexity gives the Sahara modern relevance. The ancient transition was driven by orbital conditions unlike present human-caused climate change, so the two should not be treated as direct equivalents. Yet the record shows how ecosystems can lose resilience, how drought can fracture migration routes, and how small changes in water availability can reorganize societies. It also shows that environmental decline rarely produces one simple response. People adapt, relocate, intensify old practices, invent new ones, and carry parts of lost landscapes into other regions. Today, dust from the Sahara crosses the Atlantic and fertilizes distant ecosystems. Its mineral particles reach the Amazon, linking one continent's desert to another continent's forests. During the humid period, dust emissions were much lower because vegetation and water stabilized the ground. The difference demonstrates how profoundly the Sahara influences systems far beyond its borders. The desert is therefore not an isolated emptiness. Its changing state affects oceans, atmosphere, ecology, and human movement across great distances. When it was greener, it connected African regions now separated by aridity. When it dried, it redirected populations and altered the circulation of dust. Its history belongs to the entire planet. The most enduring lesson may be that landscapes have lives longer than civilizations but are not permanent. Rivers vanish, lakes become salt, grasslands become dunes, yet traces remain, sometimes beneath the ground, sometimes within the bodies of descendants, and sometimes on a painted wall where an animal still appears to walk through stone. The modern Sahara seems complete in its dryness, as though it has reached a final form. Deep time records say otherwise. Northern Africa has shifted between humid and arid conditions many times, paced by astronomical cycles and modified by oceans, vegetation, dust, and land surface feedbacks. In the distant future, orbital conditions may again favor greater rainfall, though the exact response will be shaped by a planet now altered by human activity. No reconstruction can simply project the ancient Green Sahara forward. For the present, The rivers remain buried. Their channels lie beneath dunes and gravel, detectable from orbit but invisible to a traveller standing above them. The lakes survive as pale basins, fossil shells, mineral layers, and memories carved into rock. The people survive through fragments, a genome from a burial, a decorated vessel, a hearth, a cattle image, a root inferred from stone carried across the land. And perhaps that is why the Green Sahara feels so haunting. It was not destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It faded unevenly, leaving enough evidence to prove it existed, but not enough to recover every life within it. The desert preserved the outline of the world while erasing most of its voices. As evening settles across the dunes, the surface cools quickly. Wind moves along the slopes, softening tracks and lifting grains from one ridge to another. The horizon becomes simple again, stone, sand, and an immense darkening sky. Nothing in that view immediately suggests rivers, cattle, reeds, fish, or human camps beside open water. But beneath the quiet ground, the older landscape remains. A channel runs toward a vanished coast. A shoreline curves around an empty basin. Ancient rain rests inside deep rock. Pollen lies sealed in lake mud. A small painted figure floats forever on the wall of a shelter, suspended between water and meaning. The people who made that figure could not know how completely their world would change. They knew drought, movement, and return. They knew that lakes rose and fell. Perhaps they believed the rain would always come back eventually, because for generations it had. Then one return became weaker than the last. The shoreline moved farther away. The grass thinned. Herds followed the remaining green paths. Camps were lifted. Fires went cold, and familiar places passed slowly from home into memory. Time continued. Wind entered the abandoned shelters. Sand crossed the old lake beds. Rivers disappeared beneath the desert, and the desert itself came to seem eternal. Yet eternity was only an illusion of the present. The Sahara had once held another sky reflected in water. It had carried rivers across distances now measured in drought. It had gathered animals and people around lakes broad enough to fill the horizon. That world is gone, but not entirely erased. It waits in layers, channels, bones, pigments, and genes. It waits beneath every modern image of emptiness, reminding us that landscapes can forget their own appearance while still preserving the evidence of what they were. And under the stars, where the dunes now lie silent, the vanished rivers continue towards seas they reached thousands of years ago.